I've been working as a park ranger for over 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of strange and unsettling things out in the woods. But what happened back in 2016 near the Delaware State Forest in eastern Pennsylvania has stuck with me more than almost anything else. I wasn't on duty when it happened, not technically. I was off shift but still staying within the area for the week, helping cover a few primitive campsites that didn't see many visitors. I'd been doing spot checks for illegal hunting, dumping, and squatting in the deeper parts of the forest, places with no cell signal, no running water, and dirt roads that could barely be called roads anymore. I remember that time of year well because it was early summer, hot during the day but the kind of damp cold at night that crawls through your clothes. The forest was thick with humidity, and the air carried a heavy scent of moss and wet bark. I'd set up my own small tent not far from a gravel pull-off near one of the unmaintained roads, a place few people ever went. Primitive camping was allowed there, but only a handful of people ever used it because of how isolated it was. I knew every inch of that stretch, every old logging path and overgrown road. It was quiet, untouched, and easy to forget how deep you were in the woods until the sun went down and everything turned black and silent. That day, I'd logged about 15 miles on foot, checking trail markers and scanning for illegal fire pits. By dusk, I was exhausted. Around that same time, I noticed a small blue sedan and a white pickup driving the same road I had just patrolled. The pickup was pulled off to the side, hood open, a woman standing near it. She looked like she was waiting for someone. I slowed my truck but didn't stop. Something about the way she stood there bothered me. She wasn't flagging anyone down. She wasn't looking under the hood. She was just watching the road. Most people who need help show signs of panic or at least urgency, but she didn't. It felt staged somehow. I remember writing down her license plate in my log just in case. A few hours later, as the sky dimmed to gray, I passed a couple's campsite not far from one of the clearings. They were maybe in their 20s, young, probably just on a weekend trip. They had a small tent and a half-burnt campfire going. I nodded as I drove by but didn't stop. The man looked up for a second, his hands covered in mud from stacking firewood. They looked normal enough. I remember that because when I later looked back, I kept replaying that brief moment, wondering if they had any idea what was out there that night. After dark, I settled in with my logbook, sitting inside my truck with a lantern on. The forest was still, and the sound of crickets and tree frogs filled the air. It was the kind of calm that never lasts in the woods. Around midnight, I killed the light and leaned back, trying to get some sleep. Sometime later, closer to 3 in the morning, a sound woke me up. It wasn't an animal sound, not even close. It started low and mechanical, almost like metal grinding on metal. It came in short bursts, echoing off the trees. My first thought was an engine, maybe a generator or a chain being dragged, but it had this strange pulsing rhythm to it, like someone revving a piece of heavy machinery and then stopping. I sat there listening. The sound carried through the forest in waves. It would stop, then start again. It was impossible to tell how far away it was. In dense woods, sound can travel for miles or bounce around like it's coming from every direction. But my gut told me it wasn't far, maybe down the road, maybe a few hundred yards at most. When you work as a ranger long enough, you learn to tell when a sound belongs in the woods and when it doesn't. This didn't. I stepped out of the truck, flashlight in hand, and listened. I could hear the dripping of water from the trees, the faint rush of wind, but then the sound came again. Loud, metallic, dragging. It stopped abruptly, followed by total silence. Even the insects went quiet. I waited there for maybe 10 minutes, scanning the dark. Nothing moved. Eventually, the night sounds returned, hesitant at first, like the forest was testing whether it was safe to continue. I got back in my truck, locked the doors, and stayed awake the rest of the night. At sunrise, I decided to check the area where I thought the noise had come from. The ground was soaked from the rain earlier that week, so I could see tire tracks clearly in the mud. They didn't belong to me. They were fresh, leading down the same narrow path where I'd seen that young couple camping. I followed them slowly, tires slipping in the muck. The tracks eventually curved into a small clearing where their camp had been. When I got there, the fire pit was cold and scattered. Their tent was gone. At first glance, it looked like they had packed up and left early. But when I stepped closer, I noticed little things that didn't add up. A few food wrappers were half buried in the mud, a single boot print near the edge of the fire, and an empty beer can lying by the ashes. I picked it up. It was wet but not rusted. It hadn't been there long. What made it strange was that I'd checked that site the previous afternoon, and I distinctly remembered they didn't have any beer cans. I didn't even see a cooler. I followed the tracks farther down the trail until the mud thinned out and became gravel. That's where they disappeared. It was like the car had backed out carefully to avoid leaving more prints. I stood there a while, trying to make sense of it. If they'd left in a hurry, why take down the tent so neatly? Why leave one beer can and nothing else? And why had I heard that strange grinding sound hours before, right in this direction? Over the next day, I checked every turnout and side path along that road. I didn't find their car, and no new tracks showed up. It wasn't until 3 days later that I saw a report come through from the main ranger office. A complaint about loud noises and a strange man driving through the primitive campsites at night in a dark sedan. The description matched the same car I'd seen passing through earlier in the week. By then, the couple had already called the local sheriff's office to report what they described as a possible attempted break-in at their campsite. I later read the report. Around 3 a.m., they heard the same sound I'd heard, followed by footsteps around their tent. They stayed quiet, waited, and when things went silent again, they packed up and left immediately. When they checked the site before driving off, they found that same beer can by their fire, the same one I'd picked up. They hadn't brought beer. They told the sheriff they thought someone had been trying to lure them out of the tent, maybe even get them to investigate the noise. They said they'd noticed a woman with a truck earlier that day, and a man driving the same car in circles, watching them. Neither person was ever found or identified. For weeks after, I kept returning to that site. Every time I went, I found something off. Fresh tire tracks where no one should have been, empty cans, cigarette butts, even once a piece of rope tied to a branch like someone had been marking the spot. It felt like whoever had been out there was still coming back. After that season, the Park Service decided to officially close off that stretch of road to primitive camping. Too many strange reports had come in. Vehicles idling at night, campfires seen deep in the woods where no one had permits, distant mechanical noises with no source. I still think about that couple sometimes, how close they came to something awful that night. They got lucky. Whatever was in those woods, whoever had been watching them didn't get the chance. I've seen a lot of dark things as a ranger. Accidents, disappearances, the kind of ugliness people bring with them when they think no one's watching. But that night reminded me how isolation changes everything. Out there, there's no one to hear you, no one to call, and if something happens, all that's left are the tracks in the mud and the sound that wakes you up in the dark. Even now, when I drive past that old road, I can still picture that clearing. It's overgrown now, quiet again, but I never stop. I've learned that some places in the forest remember things even if no one else does. I was stationed at a mid-sized national park in the southeast, the kind that didn't draw huge crowds but had a loyal flow of regular hikers, campers, and birdwatchers. The area was mostly rolling forest, creeks that fed into a slow river, and a few stretches of steep limestone ridges that caught the morning light in a strange, quiet way. It was peaceful most days. Just long hours of patrolling trails, clearing debris after storms, or helping lost visitors find their way back to the main road. I'd been doing it for years, and while some days felt long and uneventful, I liked the routine. It kept me calm. It was late spring when I first noticed the old couple. They were always together, moving slowly but with a sort of focus, like they had a purpose out there. The man had on a faded blue jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that probably belonged to another decade. The woman wore a pale yellow sweater, even though the weather was warm, and carried an old film camera around her neck. They came by the visitor center 3 days in a row, always polite, always smiling. I'd seen enough visitors to recognize when people were looking for something, and that's what they were doing. They had a worn envelope with old photographs inside, faded prints that showed them standing near a river bend, the kind that could have been anywhere in the park. They told me they were visiting from out west, and that they'd gotten engaged somewhere inside the park decades ago. They were trying to find the exact spot again before heading back home. From the photos, I could tell the place they were looking for had probably changed a lot over the years. Trees grew differently. Floods had shifted the banks, and a few of the old trails weren't even used anymore. But something about their quiet determination made me want to help. I looked at the photos for a long time, trying to match the ridge lines and the curves of the river in my head. I thought I knew the general area. I offered to take them in my ranger vehicle to the point where the old service road met the river trail. From there, we hiked the rest of the way on foot. The hike wasn't long, maybe a mile and a half, but for them it took time. They walked slowly, and the man kept looking around, studying the trees, the sky, the sound of the water. When we reached a section of the river where the ground opened up into a soft, grassy bank, the woman stopped. She looked at the river and then at her husband. I could tell by their faces that this was it. They sat down near the water's edge, and I told them I'd head back to the station. I didn't think much of it then. They seemed content, almost peaceful, like they were finally closing a long chapter of their lives. The sun was high and the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine sap. I left them there, took the service road back, and went about the rest of my shift. When I got back to the station, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, more like an unease that came from nowhere. I tried to brush it off. The day went on, the usual paperwork, radio checks, and the quiet hours before closing time. But as the sun began to fall behind the ridge, I realized I hadn't seen them drive out. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much about it. People often stayed a little past the usual time to watch the sunset. But something kept me from locking up and heading home. I waited another half hour, then called my assistant at the gate to ask if the couple had exited. He said no. That's when I decided to go back. The sky was turning a deep gray blue as I took the truck back down the service road. The woods at dusk have a way of feeling heavier, like the air itself presses closer. I parked near the trail and started walking in, flashlight in hand, though there was still some light left. Every sound stood out. Frogs along the banks, wind in the brush, the steady rhythm of my boots on the dirt. When I reached the clearing by the river, I saw them. They were lying together on the grass, side by side, the woman curled slightly into the man's chest, his arm wrapped around her like he was keeping her warm. For a moment, I thought they were asleep. I even stopped a few yards away, not wanting to disturb them. But then I saw the stillness, not the kind that comes from rest, but from something final. There was a small open bag near them and a few pill bottles, some empty, some half full. I remember how quiet it was, not even the sound of insects. The river moved gently behind them, and their faces looked calm, almost content. I radioed it in, stayed there until help arrived, and then went through all the routine questions: time of discovery, condition, what I'd seen. The paramedics arrived first, then the county sheriff's team, then the coroner. I watched them go through the process, zip up the bags, collect the evidence. The smell of the river mixed with the faint chemical scent that hung in the air from whatever they had taken. After everyone left, I stood there alone for a while. The moon had come up by then, just a thin silver curve over the water. I kept thinking about how deliberate it all looked. They had chosen that place. They had known exactly what they were doing. It wasn't desperation, not panic. It was a decision. A few days later, the authorities confirmed their identities and told me the rest. The woman had been diagnosed with terminal cancer months before. The man had been her husband of more than 40 years. They had planned the trip together, a final visit to the place where he'd proposed. They hadn't told anyone what they were going to do. From the reports, they had mixed a combination of medication and some kind of industrial chemical that caused them to go unconscious quickly. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of anything except a quiet end. I thought a lot about it after that. I'd seen plenty of bad things as a ranger: accidents, drownings, hikers who fell from cliffs. But this felt different. It wasn't violent or messy. It was calm, almost too calm. I wondered if they'd known I'd come back. Maybe that's why they waited until I left. Maybe they didn't want me to see it happen. Or maybe they wanted to make sure someone would find them before the night animals did. I'll never know. For weeks after, I avoided that trail. Every time I tried to patrol near the river, I felt the same weight in my chest. It wasn't fear, just a heaviness that came from knowing that I'd walked someone right to the end of their life without realizing it. I stopped at that spot once months later, when the leaves had started to fall. The grass had grown back where they'd lain, and there was no trace left, not even the faint chemical smell. Just the quiet river, the same bend, the same light through the trees. I still think about them sometimes, especially in the evenings when the park gets quiet and the air cools. There's something unsettling about how peaceful that place feels now. I've come to believe they didn't choose it by accident. They wanted that moment to be beautiful, even if it meant ending everything. I don't think they were running from death. I think they were walking toward it together. And that's the part that stays with me, long after the reports were filed and the photos were archived. That the woods I guard every day held the last quiet moments of two people who didn't want to be anywhere else in the world. When I think back on that trip, I still get this uneasy feeling in my stomach, like I saw something I shouldn't have, something that wasn't meant to be found. It wasn't supernatural or anything like that, it was just wrong in a way that's hard to explain. My cousin worked with the Forest Service doing hydrology testing around the Montana-Wyoming border, and I had always wanted to tag along on one of her field runs. She had told me how peaceful it was, riding through open ranges and camping near streams where no one ever went. I figured it would be a good break from everything back home. We left early one morning in late September. The air was crisp enough to sting my nose when I breathed in. The sky was a perfect washed-out blue that only happens in those higher elevations. My cousin packed her usual testing equipment, collection jars, a handheld sensor, some field notes, and we loaded everything onto our horses. The plan was simple. 2 days out, 2 nights camping, testing runoff and stream quality at a few designated sites. The first day felt perfect. The horses moved at an easy pace, their hooves crunching softly through pine needles. The air smelled of sap and cold dirt. Every so often I'd see elk tracks pressed deep in the soil or hear the distant roll of a hawk. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, we had reached a narrow valley with a stream cutting straight through it. We set up camp beside it. The sound of the water was low and steady, like background static. We made a fire, heated up a small pot of beans, and I remember thinking how far removed from everything it felt. No cell signal, no distant traffic, not even the hum of power lines. Just stillness. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning we packed up and started following the stream uphill. Around mid-morning we reached an open slope covered with tall, pale grass that shimmered under the sun. It was then that my cousin mentioned there was something strange nearby, something she had come across on a past trip. She didn't explain what, only said it was weird and worth seeing. I didn't think much of it. Out there, people sometimes found old mining equipment or remnants of logging camps. Maybe that was it. We left our original path, heading east into a series of folds between hills. The land grew tighter, more uneven. Small pines and dry brush crowded the narrow ravine we followed. It took us almost 2 hours to reach the bottom, a secluded little clearing where the ground leveled out beside a cluster of rocks and low trees. It felt like the kind of place no one had set foot in for decades. We tied up the horses and began walking. The air down there was oddly still. No birdsong, no wind moving through the trees, just the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. I noticed the soil looked disturbed in one area, like something had been dug up years ago and filled back in. Then a few yards ahead I saw it, a length of wire sticking out of the ground. It was about the size of standard house wiring, maybe 10 or 12 gauge, and covered in a dull, weathered sheath. It wasn't coiled neatly. It was tangled, looping through the dirt before disappearing into the brush. I crouched down, thinking maybe it was part of some old installation, maybe from a long-gone weather station or an old research post. But the insulation didn't look old enough to be from the early 1900s or anything like that. It was cracked and dirty but still flexible, more like something from a few decades ago. I started following the wire. It snaked up over roots, then looped around a fallen log. At points it had been carefully strung through the branches of trees. as if someone had taken time to suspend it just above the ground. It wasn't haphazard. Whoever did it had a plan. The line ran maybe 40 or 50 yards before coming to something that made my stomach drop. In a small opening surrounded by pines stood a desk. Just a regular metal-frame school desk, the kind with drawers on one side and a laminate top that looked fake wood. It was half covered in needles and dirt, but it wasn't rusted out or rotten. There was no chair, no papers, no sign of any other equipment, just that desk. Mounted to its side, clean and deliberate, was a single electrical outlet box. The wire I had been following ran straight into it. For a long time I just stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. There was nothing around to justify it. No cabin, no generator, no sign of construction. Just a desk and an outlet, in a hollow of forest miles from the nearest road. I had brought along a small hand-crank radio with a built-in light, one of those things meant for camping emergencies. Out of pure curiosity, I plugged it into the outlet. The light on the radio blinked red immediately, showing it was charging. Then, when I switched it on, the speaker came alive with static, real power. That's when the unease really hit me. There was no sound of a generator, no buried hum, no sign of solar panels or any other source. But the outlet worked. Somewhere unseen there was a live current feeding that wire, and someone had gone through a lot of effort to make it reach this one specific spot. I walked in circles around the clearing, checking the ground for signs of equipment or tools. The soil near the desk was hard-packed, not freshly disturbed. The trees nearby didn't have any markings or cut limbs. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years, yet the power was still on. After a while, I noticed faint impressions in the dirt near the desk. Not footprints exactly. More like areas where heavy objects had once rested, maybe old crates or boxes. The wire itself was mostly buried in loose soil, suggesting it had been intentionally hidden for a time. I even followed it backward for a while, but it just kept disappearing into the earth before surfacing again several yards away. Almost like it had been rerouted in places. There was no explanation that made complete sense. The logical part of my mind tried to piece something together. Maybe it had been part of a long-term environmental study, or an old communications relay that had never been removed. But why hide it so carefully? Why the single desk, the working outlet, the complete lack of any other structure? We stayed there for a bit longer, both of us just trying to take it in. The longer I stood there, the more wrong the place felt. The silence was heavy, almost pressing. Even when the radio hissed with static, it didn't feel like sound belonged there. Eventually, we left it as it was. I unplugged the radio and wound up the cord. When we got back to the horses, I looked over my shoulder. The desk was barely visible through the trees, but that single outlet on its side caught the sunlight for a moment, a dull reflection of white against the green. We rode back the same way we came, climbing out of the ravine until the sound of the wind returned. I remember feeling relieved once the open landscape stretched in front of us again. It was like crossing an invisible line back into normalcy. Later that night at camp, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept imagining someone years ago hauling that desk out there piece by piece, burying the line, setting it up for a reason that was now completely gone. Maybe it was part of some forgotten project. Maybe it was used for monitoring or testing something they didn't want recorded on maps. Whatever the case, it was still live, still quietly feeding power to a place no one should have reason to visit. We finished the rest of our trip as planned and went home 2 days later. I didn't tell many people about what we found. Even now, I don't really know what to make of it. It's not haunted or cursed or anything like that. It's just there, deep in the forest, quietly running off a hidden source. Sometimes I think about how power lines crisscross under the ground, how old networks get left behind when new ones replace them. Maybe this was part of one of those forgotten systems, a leftover connection still bleeding a little electricity into nowhere. But that doesn't explain the desk. That image, one desk, one outlet, alive and waiting in the middle of untouched forest, has stayed with me ever since. Not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded me how much of the world is built on things we don't see. Things that keep running quietly after everyone forgets they exist. I was camping deep in the Everglades during one of my solo patrols, the kind where I stay out for several nights checking back trails and monitoring campsites most visitors never see. I was used to the isolation, the stillness, the low hum of mosquitoes, and the slow movements of the swamp. It's the kind of silence that presses on you after dark, where even a frog's croak sounds too loud. I had parked my government-issued convertible along a narrow dirt track that led into a patch of dry ground surrounded by cypress knees and thick sawgrass. It wasn't an ideal ranger vehicle, but it had been assigned to me that week since the trucks were in for maintenance. I made do with it. Because of my back problems, I never sleep on the hard ground anymore. I've got an old sleeping pad, but it doesn't help much, so I just fold the front seats forward, lay out a sleeping bag in the back, and rest there. The top of the car is cloth, thin enough that I can hear every insect that lands on it. The Everglades at night are alive in a way most people can't imagine. Small feet scuttling, wings brushing, distant splashes where something big enters the water. I've spent enough nights out there to tell the difference between an alligator slipping into a canal and a raccoon rummaging through dry leaves. That night, I had finished a long day of marking invasive plant growth and making notes about illegal fire pits I found along a closed trail. My back was killing me. I ate a small dinner, a sandwich, a banana, a bottle of water, and stored the rest of my food in the compartment behind the back seat. I knew raccoons were clever, but I figured they wouldn't get into the car. I left the windows cracked open for air, since even in December the Everglades air sits heavy and warm, with that faint rot smell of decaying vegetation that never quite goes away. I lay there trying to find a comfortable position when I heard something soft land on the roof. At first I thought it might have been a branch dropping from a tree, but then it started moving. Deliberate, heavy steps like something with weight shifting carefully from one spot to another. The sound came from directly above me. I knew right away it was a raccoon. They have that slow, padded walk, almost lazy but firm enough that you can feel the pressure through the fabric. I could tell he was big. Most raccoons I'd seen out there were small, quick, and lean, but this one was hefty enough to make the cloth dip slightly with each step. I could see the shape of his body shifting the roof when the moonlight hit it. My first thought was that he'd tear through the top trying to find food. The cloth wasn't meant to hold weight, and I'd had enough issues with the park's wildlife getting too bold around people, so I reached up and pushed hard at the spot above me. The roof flexed and the animal scrambled away, claws skittering against the surface as he jumped off. I lay still for a while, listening. The swamp went quiet again. That deep, muffled silence between insect bursts. Then 10 minutes later I heard him climb back on. The sound was unmistakable. Claws gripping the edge, a soft thump as he pulled himself up, and those same deliberate steps. I pushed again, harder this time, and felt the whole car shake slightly. He scrambled away again. This little back and forth went on for a while, maybe half an hour of him returning, me pushing at the roof, him leaving again. I started to feel more annoyed than anything. I was exhausted, drenched in sweat from the heat, and the last thing I wanted was to spend the night playing games with a raccoon. Eventually, the noise stopped completely. I waited another 10 minutes before I finally let myself relax. It was around 2 in the morning when I started drifting off. The air was thick, my shirt clinging to my skin. I could hear small ripples of water outside. The faint buzz of mosquitoes pressing against the mesh of the window. Then I heard something new, a soft rustling from the front of the car. I thought maybe it was wind moving through the brush, but it was too rhythmic. I opened my eyes slowly, and that's when I saw it. The raccoon was sitting in the driver's seat. He was turned toward me, perched upright with his front paws on the top of the seat back, staring directly at me over it. The moonlight through the windshield lit his face. Black mask markings, wet nose glinting, eyes reflecting faintly. For a moment I froze. My first thought wasn't fear, but disbelief. He must have climbed in through the open window. I could see the faint scratch marks along the side where he'd pulled himself up. He looked calm, curious, not even scared. Just sitting there, staring at me. I lunged forward instinctively, and he bolted. I heard the scramble of claws across the seat. A thump as he hit the door, and then he was gone, vanishing into the brush outside. I sat there breathing hard, the sound of insects filling the silence again. I closed the windows the rest of the way and decided I wasn't getting any more sleep that night. My nerves were too wound up. I got up around dawn, maybe 6 in the morning. The swamp looked peaceful again. Golden light breaking over the trees, mist drifting above the water. The convertible's roof was marked with little muddy footprints. I stretched my back, sore and stiff, then remembered the food I had stashed behind the back seat. When I reached back to check it, the loaf of bread was gone. The wrapper was missing too. I walked a few feet away from the car and found it under a small tree, shredded and empty. That raccoon had waited me out. He'd probably been watching from the dark the whole time, waiting for me to finally leave the car. When I went to the bathroom sometime after 3, he must have climbed in through the cracked window again and dragged the bread out. 18 slices of double fiber wheat bread and gone. He didn't even leave crumbs. Standing there under that tree looking at the torn plastic, I couldn't help but imagine what eating that much fiber must have done to his stomach. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Out there in the Everglades, animals learn quick. Sometimes too quick. That raccoon had figured out every step I'd take before I did. By the time I packed up and headed out that morning, the sun was climbing, the swamp steaming under the heat. I drove the dirt trail slow, windows down again, listening to the buzz of insects and the faint cries of herons in the distance. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw a flash of movement near the spot I'd camped. Something gray and quick slipping between the cypress roots. Maybe it was the same raccoon, maybe not. But I had a feeling he'd be waiting for the next camper. A little smarter, a little bolder, and a lot more full of fiber than any raccoon had a right to be. That was the last time I ever left food in the car. Out there in the still heat of the Everglades, I learned something simple. The wild always finds its way in one way or another. I was camping deep in the Everglades during one of my solo patrols, the kind where I stay out for several nights checking back trails and monitoring campsites most visitors never see. I was used to the isolation, the stillness, the low hum of mosquitoes, and the slow movements of the swamp. It's the kind of silence that presses on you after dark, where even a frog's croak sounds too loud. I had parked my government-issued convertible along a narrow dirt track that led into a patch of dry ground surrounded by cypress knees and thick sawgrass. It wasn't an ideal ranger vehicle, but it had been assigned to me that week since the trucks were in for maintenance. I made do with it. Because of my back problems, I never sleep on the hard ground anymore. I've got an old sleeping pad, but it doesn't help much, so I just fold the front seats forward, lay out a sleeping bag in the back, and rest there. The top of the car is cloth, thin enough that I can hear every insect that lands on it. The Everglades at night are alive in a way most people can't imagine. Small feet scuttling, wings brushing, distant splashes where something big enters the water. I've spent enough nights out there to tell the difference between an alligator slipping into a canal and a raccoon rummaging through dry leaves. That night, I had finished a long day of marking invasive plant growth and making notes about illegal fire pits I found along a closed trail. My back was killing me. I ate a small dinner, a sandwich, a banana, a bottle of water, and stored the rest of my food in the compartment behind the back seat. I knew raccoons were clever, but I figured they wouldn't get into the car. I left the windows cracked open for air, since even in December the Everglades air sits heavy and warm, with that faint rot smell of decaying vegetation that never quite goes away. I lay there trying to find a comfortable position when I heard something soft land on the roof. At first I thought it might have been a branch dropping from a tree. But then it started moving, deliberate heavy steps like something with weight shifting carefully from one spot to another. The sound came from directly above me. I knew right away it was a raccoon. They have that slow padded walk, almost lazy but firm enough that you can feel the pressure through the fabric. I could tell he was big. Most raccoons I'd seen out there were small, quick, and lean, but this one was hefty enough to make the cloth dip slightly with each step. I could see the shape of his body shifting the roof when the moonlight hit it. My first thought was that he'd tear through the top trying to find food. The cloth wasn't meant to hold weight, and I'd had enough issues with the park's wildlife getting too bold around people, so I reached up and pushed hard at the spot above me. The roof flexed and the animal scrambled away, claws skittering against the surface as he jumped off. I lay still for a while, listening. The swamp went quiet again, that deep, muffled silence between insect bursts. Then 10 minutes later I heard him climb back on. The sound was unmistakable, claws gripping the edge, a soft thump as he pulled himself up, and those same deliberate steps. I pushed again, harder this time, and felt the whole car shake slightly. He scrambled away again. This little back and forth went on for a while, maybe half an hour of him returning, me pushing at the roof, him leaving again. I started to feel more annoyed than anything. I was exhausted, drenched in sweat from the heat, and the last thing I wanted was to spend the night playing games with a raccoon. Eventually, the noise stopped completely. I waited another 10 minutes before I finally let myself relax. It was around 2 in the morning when I started drifting off. The air was thick, my shirt clinging to my skin. I could hear small ripples of water outside, the faint buzz of mosquitoes pressing against the mesh of the window. Then I heard something new, a soft rustling from the front of the car. I thought maybe it was wind moving through the brush, but it was too rhythmic. I opened my eyes slowly, and that's when I saw it. The raccoon was sitting in the driver's seat. He was turned toward me, perched upright with his front paws on the top of the seat back, staring directly at me over it. The moonlight through the windshield lit his face, black mask markings, wet nose glinting, eyes reflecting faintly. For a moment I froze. My first thought wasn't fear, but disbelief. He must have climbed in through the open window. I could see the faint scratch marks along the side where he'd pulled himself up. He looked calm, curious, not even scared. Just sitting there staring at me. I lunged forward instinctively and he bolted. I heard the scramble of claws across the seat, a thump as he hit the door, and then he was gone, vanishing into the brush outside. I sat there breathing hard, the sound of insects filling the silence again. I closed the windows the rest of the way and decided I wasn't getting any more sleep that night. My nerves were too wound up. I got up around dawn, maybe 6 in the morning. The swamp looked peaceful again, golden light breaking over the trees, mist drifting above the water. The convertible's roof was marked with little muddy footprints. I stretched my back, sore and stiff, then remembered the food I had stashed behind the back seat. When I reached back to check it, the loaf of bread was gone. The wrapper was missing too. I walked a few feet away from the car and found it under a small tree, shredded and empty. That raccoon had waited me out. He'd probably been watching from the dark the whole time, waiting for me to finally leave the car. When I went to the bathroom sometime after 3, he must have climbed in through the cracked window again and dragged the bread out. 18 slices of double-fiber wheat bread been gone. He didn't even leave crumbs. Standing there under that tree, looking at the torn plastic, I couldn't help but imagine what eating that much fiber must have done to his stomach. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Out there in the Everglades, animals learn quick, sometimes too quick. That raccoon had figured out every step I'd take before I did. By the time I packed up and headed out that morning, the sun was climbing, the swamp steaming under the heat. I drove the dirt trail slow, windows down again, listening to the buzz of insects and the faint cries of herons in the distance. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw a flash of movement near the spot I'd camped, something gray and quick slipping between the cypress roots. Maybe it was the same raccoon, maybe not, but I had a feeling he'd be waiting for the next camper, a little smarter, a little bolder, and a lot more full of fiber than any raccoon had a right to be. That was the last time I ever left food in the car. Out there in the still heat of the Everglades, I learned something simple. The wild always finds its way in one way or another. I had never planned on crossing a border that day. The hike was supposed to be easy, an 8-hour loop through the Pyrenees, starting in Andorra and ending back where we'd parked near Ordino. I'd gone with a friend from university who had done a bit of hiking before, and we packed light. Just snacks, 2 bottles of water each, a cheap compass, and a downloaded map on her phone. The air that morning was cold but bright, the kind that makes everything look sharper than it really is. The slopes were covered in low pine, their needles shining with dew. We started early, around 7, and by 10 the sun was already burning hot against the back of my neck. The trail climbed and dropped in slow curves, cutting through sections of thick brush before opening into meadows with short yellow grass. We had planned to stop for lunch near a small glacial lake marked on the map, but by noon the signal had dropped completely, and the map froze on her phone. We didn't think much of it at first. The path was marked with old red-white blazes painted on rocks, and as long as we followed them, we thought we'd be fine. It wasn't until later in the afternoon that things started to go wrong. We came to a split in the trail where the markings seemed to have faded, and a wooden sign that must have once pointed somewhere had broken in half, hanging from a single nail. We decided to go left because it looked more walked on. The ground was dry, the air thinner now, and every sound, our boots scraping rocks, our breath echoed up the slope. We walked for another hour before realizing there hadn't been a single trail marker in a long time. We turned around, but the path behind us looked different somehow, narrower, as if it hadn't been walked in years. The shadows stretched longer between the trees, and the wind carried a faint smell of burnt wood. We kept walking, guessing the direction we'd come from, but every ridge and valley started to look the same. I remember looking at my watch. It was close to 5 in the evening, and the light had already gone golden. My friend was starting to panic quietly. Her lips cracked from the dry air. When we finally stumbled out onto another path, I almost laughed in relief. It was wider and seemed more used, with fresh boot prints pressed into the dust. The trail curved down along a slope toward what looked like a small river glinting in the distance. We followed it, thinking it must lead to a road or a village. That was when I first saw him. A man, maybe in his 30s, walking ahead of us with 2 golden retrievers. He had climbing ropes looped over one shoulder and was moving quickly, the dogs darting in and out of the brush beside him. Even from far away I could tell he was fit, his steps light and sure. We picked up our pace, hoping to catch up, the thought of another human out there bringing a sudden sense of safety. By the time we reached him, we were sweating and out of breath. He looked friendly, his hair messy from the wind, the dogs panting happily. He told us we were already in Spain, that we'd crossed the border somewhere back up the ridge. I remember the shock that hit me at that moment, the idea that we'd walked out of one country without even noticing. He said there was a small town about 6 kilometers away where he had parked his car, and another bigger one 12 kilometers further with a hotel. He said he could give us a lift for the last stretch if we wanted. It sounded like the best news of the day. We started walking together. The dogs kept running circles around us, brushing against my legs with their warm fur. The man talked easily, pointing out peaks and naming them. My friend smiled again for the first time in hours. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found him. But the trail was steep and long, and my legs began to ache from the constant descent. He seemed to move faster the further we went, barely slowing down to adjust the gear on his shoulder. After a while, we fell behind. The sun was low now, sinking between the ridges, and the light had turned orange and sharp. I could hear the man's footsteps somewhere ahead, the dogs' collars jingling faintly. Then the trail curved right, cutting through a dense patch of trees. I watched him and the dogs disappear around the bend, maybe 20 meters ahead. My friend and I pushed ourselves to keep pace, but when we reached the bend, the trail beyond was empty. At first I thought he had taken a side path, but there wasn't one. The trail ran straight for at least 100 meters before it dipped out of sight, open and clear. I stopped and scanned the trees. Nothing, no sound of footsteps, no dogs panting. Just wind moving through the pines and the faint rush of a river somewhere far below. My friend looked pale, her breathing shallow. We stood there for a minute, waiting to hear something. But there was only silence. We kept walking. The trail grew darker, the trees closing in. Every few minutes I turned around, half expecting to see him behind us or hear the dogs running. But the forest stayed quiet. I began to wonder if he'd cut across the slope through the trees, maybe taking a shortcut to his car. But there were no tracks in the dust except ours. No paw prints either. It was as if he and the dogs had just vanished into the air. By the time we reached the town, the light was almost gone. It was small, maybe 10 buildings clustered near a narrow road. A few cars were parked along the side, and smoke curled from a chimney. I remember feeling a sudden wave of exhaustion, my legs shaking from the long descent. We didn't see his car or the dogs or anyone walking around. The town was quiet, too quiet for the time of day. We followed the road signs, found another trail leading toward the bigger town he'd mentioned, and kept moving. It was completely dark by the time we reached the hotel. We checked in, ate, and collapsed into our beds without talking. I lay awake for a long time thinking about that man. How normal he seemed, how calm. I replayed every detail. The ropes over his shoulder, the sound of the dogs, the shape of his shadow against the trees, and none of it made sense. The next morning, after breakfast, we went to the front desk to ask about transport back to Andorra. The woman there asked where we'd come from, and when we told her, she frowned. She said the smaller town we mentioned didn't have any trail that connected directly from that side of the mountain, and that the road we'd walked down hadn't been used in years. She said it had been closed after a rockslide destroyed part of it 2 summers ago. We didn't go back to check. We just booked a taxi to Andorra and stayed quiet the entire ride. I looked out the window the whole way, watching the ridges and forests slide by. I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. If we hadn't seen him, if we'd taken another wrong turn, if we'd run out of water. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Maybe he took a shortcut we couldn't see. Maybe the dogs led him down through the trees. Maybe he never existed and we both imagined him out of exhaustion and stress. I've thought about it 100 times, trying to fit it into something logical. But the truth is, we were lost in the mountains, miles from anywhere, and a man appeared, guided us out, then vanished. When I think back to that day, I don't feel fear as much as a kind of emptiness, like we brushed against something that didn't belong to us, something we were never supposed to find. I never went hiking without a real map again, and every time I see golden retrievers on a trail, for a moment I look around, half expecting to see him walking just ahead, ropes over his shoulder, before turning a corner and disappearing again. I work as a park ranger in a remote desert park in the Southwest. It's the kind of place most people only visit in the cooler months. Summer out here isn't made for humans. Temperatures rise well over 100 degrees by mid-morning, and the land feels alive with heat. The rocks shimmer, the sand stings your legs, and even the wind feels like it's coming out of an oven. The park shuts down most of its public operations around May, but a few of us stay year-round to handle maintenance, check trails, and make sure no one's doing anything illegal on park grounds. When I first got stationed here, one of the older rangers told me a story about something that happened the summer before I arrived. The story spread around the small staff we had, but no one really liked to talk about it. It was the kind of thing that stuck with them in quiet moments, especially when we were out there alone. I didn't understand why until I heard all the details. Back then, there were only 4 of them working through the summer. The campgrounds were empty except for a few long-term sites we kept locked for maintenance or emergency use. Around mid-July, one of the maintenance rangers went out to check one of those rarely used campgrounds about 30 miles from the main station. It was the kind of place almost no one goes anymore, because the road leading in was rough and half buried under sand. The desert has a way of taking things back, and that campground had been slowly disappearing for years. When he got there, he found a car parked in one of the sites. At first, it didn't seem that strange. Sometimes people sneak in and camp without permits, but this one looked wrong right away. The windows were blackened, the metal warped and peeled. It had clearly been through a fire. The ranger said the air still smelled faintly of burnt plastic and metal, like the fire had happened not too long before. The ground around the car was scorched in a perfect circle, and even though the desert wind had started to sweep sand back over it, the shape was still clear. He radioed it in and waited. Out here, you don't touch anything until law enforcement arrives. The sheriff's office sent a deputy since we're too far from any city. The wait must have been awful. You're sitting out there, miles from the nearest person under a white-hot sky, with nothing but the crackle of wind through dry bushes and the stink of something that died. When the deputy arrived, they popped the car door open and saw what was left inside. It wasn't just burnt upholstery. There was a body in the driver's seat, or what was left of one. No arms, no legs, just the torso and head charred and stuck against the melted seat. The seatbelt had fused into what was left of the person's chest. The sheriff's department investigated briefly, but from what I was told, it didn't go very far. They wrote it off as a suicide. That's what they do a lot out here. The park borders some rough areas near the border, and we get drug traffic sometimes. The local law enforcement doesn't always dig too deep if they think it's cartel-related or a smuggling issue. They towed the car out and that was that. But what made it strange wasn't just the body. It was how clean everything else was. The rest of the campsite didn't look disturbed. No other tracks, no tire marks except for the vehicle itself, no footprints in the sand. Even stranger, the car had melted pieces of glass underneath it, which meant it had sat there while burning, not after. The fire hadn't spread outside the circle around the car, which doesn't make sense in that kind of dry terrain. Even the smallest spark usually spreads out fast. But this fire had stopped perfectly at the edge of the site, like it was contained somehow. A few days after the car was taken, the maintenance team went back out to clean the site. They said the smell was still strong, that sweet, sick kind of smell that gets into your clothes and sticks to the back of your throat. They scraped away what was left of the burnt sand and metal, threw some fresh dirt over it, and marked the site as closed. After that, they said weird things started happening around that area. Not paranormal things, just off. Tracks that went nowhere. Abandoned water bottles that weren't there before. Small fires that burned out before anyone got there. They stopped patrolling that campground altogether by the end of that summer. When I first started, I didn't think much about it. Stories in remote parks always get exaggerated. People see strange things in the desert all the time. Light distortions, mirages, dust devils. But after a few months on the job, I went to that area myself. It was quiet, too quiet. The air felt heavier there. The dirt was packed hard, almost like it had fused in the heat. Even though the fire had happened over a year ago, there was still a faint black outline on the ground where the car had been. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand how a fire like that could burn so completely and stop so precisely. Later, I asked the ranger who had first found the car if he ever got used to it. He told me something I still think about. He said the worst part wasn't the sight of it or the smell. It was realizing how easily it was forgotten. That someone could die like that in the middle of nowhere, and the world just kept going. No investigation, no family showing up, no one asking questions. Just a burnt car and a report filed under apparent suicide. That stuck with me more than anything else. Because that's what the desert does. It swallows things. It covers tracks, buries metal, erases stories. The wind smooths everything over until it's like nothing ever happened. Every time I patrol out there now, I slow down when I pass that old road. It's closed off, but you can still see where the turnoff starts, half covered in sand. There's no sign, no marker, just a faint indentation where tires used to roll. And even though I've never seen anything unusual there myself, I can't shake the thought of that car sitting there in the heat, burning silently while the rest of the desert stood still. That site's still marked as closed on our maps, but the coordinates are easy to find if you know where to look. Sometimes I think about going back to see if there's anything left. A melted piece of glass, a mark on the rocks, anything. But then I remember how the others described it, how they said the silence there didn't feel empty but waiting. So I don't go back, not because I'm scared of what I'll find, but because I'm scared there won't be anything left at all. Just more sand, more heat, and a story that no one but a few of us still remember. Out here things disappear fast, and if you're not careful you end up one of them. I used to work as a ranger at a large national park in the western states, a place known for its deep valleys, cold streams, and thick pine forests that seemed to swallow sound. The place was quiet most of the time, except during summer when the campgrounds filled with hikers, families, and groups of college kids looking to get drunk under the stars. You could tell right away which kind of group you were dealing with by the noise they made. Most campers tried to blend into the calm of the place, but sometimes we got people who treated it like their personal backyard. That's how I met the group of frat boys that summer. They rolled in one Friday evening in a shiny rental van, loud music shaking the doors, voices carrying all the way down the trail. I could smell the cheap beer from 10 feet away when they opened the cooler. They weren't bad kids, but they didn't belong out there. You could always tell who had respect for the woods and who didn't. Those who grew up camping knew when to be quiet, when to move carefully, when to keep their lights low. These boys had no idea. The first night I went by around 10 to do a check. They were yelling, tossing cans into the fire and playing some game that involved shouting every few minutes. I told them to quiet down, reminded them that sound carried easily through the valley, especially at night. I didn't mention the mountain lions then, I didn't think I needed to. But after I left, I heard them again an hour later. Around midnight I went back. Their music was still playing, and I could hear them from half a mile away. That's when I gave them the last warning. I told them that being loud wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. The locals called our lions ghost cats because they could be near you without you even knowing. They made no sound when they moved, no growl, no hiss. You only saw them when they wanted to be seen, and by then it was too late. I told them not to leave their tents that night for any reason, and if they heard anything, they should stay completely still. Then I left them with that thought and went back to the station. The thing about working that long in the park is that you get a dark sense of humor. The quiet and the isolation start to change the way you think. You see so many campers come and go, doing the same careless things, leaving trash, scaring off animals, carving names into trees. After a while, you start to find small ways to teach them lessons without real harm. That night, my partner Jim and I decided to have some fun. We had an old mountain lion pelt in the interpretation center, used for school demonstrations. It was realistic, heavy faded tan fur with a long tail and dark patches around the paws. We'd also gotten night vision goggles a few months earlier, part of some unused budget the head ranger decided to spend before the fiscal year closed. It gave us a good excuse for a prank that would make those boys think twice next time. We waited until the campground went quiet, until their fire burned down, and only the orange glow of coals showed between the tents. Around 2 a.m, we packed up the lion pelt, a PA speaker, and a few wooden sticks to hold the thing upright. Jim drove while I carried the gear out. We parked the Jeep down the hill and moved through the dark, our flashlights off. Even though it was a joke, it still made me uneasy how still everything was. The air was cold enough to see my breath, and the trees creaked softly above us. At the site, I could see the tents lined up near the fire pit. I could hear snoring from one of them. We worked quickly. I pressed the pelt up on the sticks so it stood a few feet tall, shaped roughly like a crouched cat. It wasn't perfect, but in the dark it was convincing. Jim walked around with a stick, pressing it into the soft dirt to make prints. He'd seen enough real tracks to know how to angle the claws and weight the paws so they looked natural. We circled the camp with them, going over old ashes, near the water jugs, even around the tents. When that was done, Jim crept back to the Jeep and turned on the PA system. He had a recording of real lion calls we used for ranger talks, deep, drawn-out screams that carried far in the night. The first sound came from far away, echoing faintly through the trees. Then, after a few seconds, another, a little closer. The sound rose and fell, that strange mix of growl and scream that always makes the hair on your arm stand up. I moved the Jeep closer, headlights off. When I got within 100 yards, I flicked on my mag light and swept it across the camp. The beam hit the pelt and the shape jumped into view. Because I was moving quickly, it looked like the shadow itself shifted, as if the thing were alive. I could see the tents tremble as someone inside jolted awake. A few muffled noises, maybe gasps, came from inside. Jim kept the sounds going, making them move around the camp. I stepped forward, waving the light back and forth. The silhouette moved with it, giving the illusion of motion. Then I cut the light suddenly and the forest fell dead silent. I heard rustling, quick breathing, someone whispering too loud. Then Jim shouted through the PA, pretending panic, saying it was coming around. I could hear more shuffling, the sound of fabric shaking as they huddled inside. We kept the act up for another minute before we cut everything. We grabbed the pelt, pulled out the sticks, and sprinted for the Jeep in total darkness. My heart was pounding from running blind through the woods, branches hitting my arms, gravel crunching under my boots. We jumped in, started the engine, and took off down the trail. By the time we got back to the station, it was nearly 4. We sat on the porch drinking stale coffee, still laughing about it. Jim said he'd bet money they wouldn't make another sound for the rest of the night. He was right. At dawn, we went back to check things out. The fire pit was cold and all 3 tents were zipped tight. No movement. The boys didn't step out until almost 8:30, when the sunlight was full and warm. They looked pale, stiff, and completely silent. I could see them scanning the ground, following the massive tracks in every direction, counting them, whispering among themselves. They didn't even notice us watching from the edge of the clearing. They packed up without a word, moving fast and quiet. No music, no laughter, no shouting. By 9, the van was gone and the site was empty except for the fire ashes and a crushed beer can. It became a running joke at the station for a while. The ghost cats had taught someone a lesson that night. But later, after the humor wore off, I started thinking about it differently. Those prints had looked too real, too clean. We only made a few dozen, but when we checked the area the next morning, I counted more than I remembered. Some went farther into the trees where we hadn't walked at all. They trailed off toward the creek and disappeared into the mud. I never mentioned that part to Jim. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd miscounted. But even now, when I think about that night, the cold air, the sound of the fake calls echoing in the valley, I still remember the way the forest felt right before we turned off the light. The silence wasn't the usual kind. It was deeper, heavier, like something else was listening from out there, perfectly still, waiting for the noise to stop. I had taken a week off work and decided to spend it driving up the west coast, stopping at small campgrounds near the water. I liked quiet places where I could hear the wind through the trees and the sound of waves not too far away. My back isn't in great shape, so I don't sleep on the ground anymore. I had turned the back of my car into a little sleeping space. I had a thick foam mattress that folded perfectly across the back seat, a sleeping bag and small blackout covers for each window so I could sleep in privacy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was comfortable and felt safe. That night I camped at a small site just north of a coastal town. It was the kind of place that had only about 15 campsites, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. You could smell the salt in the air from the ocean a short walk away. The ground was soft and covered in pine needles. A few other campers were spread out across the area, a van, a couple of tents, and an old RV near the entrance. I parked my car under a tree, made sure my food was stored properly, and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly, and I remember the cool air sneaking in through the cracks of the window covers as I lay inside my sleeping bag. Listening to the faint hum of crickets, I woke up once around midnight to shift my position. My lower back always got stiff after a few hours, so I stretched a little, then lay still again. The night was completely quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. I fell back asleep quickly. The next thing I remember was waking up to a strange sound early in the morning. At first I thought I was still dreaming. It was a deep rattling noise like something heavy rolling over gravel. It came in bursts, not constant but uneven, like the wheels of a shopping cart moving across a rough parking lot. It was such an odd sound to hear out there in the woods that my half-awake mind couldn't make sense of it. I just lay there for a moment trying to figure out what could make a noise like that. Then I felt it. The car shook. Not a little tremor from the wind, but a real bump that made my head move against the pillow. It felt like something had hit the side of the vehicle, maybe from the rear. The whole frame gave a low metallic creak as it settled back into place. My heart started pounding instantly. I lay completely still, staring up at the ceiling of the car, my breath held. I thought maybe it was a person at first. Maybe someone had tripped over the bumper or leaned on the car accidentally. But the site next to me had been empty the night before, and I hadn't heard any footsteps or voices. The air outside was completely still, and that rumbling sound was fading but still there. Moving past me, slow and heavy, I started unzipping the sleeping bag from the inside, but it caught halfway down. I fumbled with it, trying to keep quiet even though I wasn't sure why. The zipper teeth snagged on the fabric and I had to wiggle it free before I could sit up. My adrenaline was spiking so hard that my fingers were shaking. I finally pushed the bag open and sat up, peering through the small gap in one of the window covers. There was nothing. The trees stood motionless in the dim morning light. The sky had that pale gray color that comes right before sunrise. and I could just barely make out the outlines of the picnic table, the fire ring, and the gravel parking pad. I didn't see anyone walking. No movement in the brush, no animal shapes in the distance. The sound had completely stopped. I stayed like that for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, waiting, trying to listen for anything. Nothing moved. The quiet was heavy and unnatural. I finally slid out of the sleeping bag, unlocked the doors as quietly as I could, and opened the back hatch just a little to peek outside. The air was cold and damp, the kind that clings to your skin and smells faintly like pine sap and ocean mist. I stepped out and circled the car, checking the ground. The dirt around the tires had deep impression, wide, uneven, and heavy. They weren't tire marks. They looked more like something large had walked by and brushed against the car as it did. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints weren't clear enough to tell exactly what they belonged to, but they were big, and there were several of them leading off toward the tree line behind my sight. The edges were soft from the damp earth, but I could see where the weight had pressed the soil down deep. My mind started running through possibilities. I'd camped enough to know that bears were common in the region, especially near the coast. But the rumbling sound didn't fit. Bears walk softly. Even big ones can move quietly. That metallic, rolling, gravelly sound didn't sound like any animal movement I'd ever heard. I thought maybe it was a deer or elk rubbing against the car, but again, that didn't explain the sound either. I went over to where the prints disappeared into the trees. The underbrush was disturbed, branches bent, and a few patches of wet grass flattened. Whatever it was had definitely gone through there. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't fear in the sense of danger, more like confusion mixed with that instinct that tells you something isn't quite right. I kept scanning the woods for movement, but everything stayed still. I decided to wait until full daylight before packing up. I sat at the picnic table, drinking from my water bottle, still listening for that sound again. Nothing. Just birds starting to call as the sun came up. By the time the light fully filled the clearing, I walked back to the car to inspect it again. On the back bumper there was a smear, not a scratch exactly, but a faint muddy streak, like something had brushed past it with enough force to move the whole vehicle. I left the campground an hour later. I checked out at the small ranger station on the way out and told the ranger what happened, mostly because I wanted to know what kind of animal could bump a car like that. He said there were elk in the area, and sometimes they wandered through campgrounds at night, though he admitted it was rare for one to come that close. He also said bears occasionally nudged vehicles if they smelled food inside, but I hadn't had any in the car. I've thought about that morning many times since. The rumbling sound is what I can't get past. It was rhythmic, uneven, and deep, like the ground itself was vibrating. I've camped dozens of times after that in other places, and I've never heard anything like it again. It's probably something simple, maybe an elk brushing past while a nearby truck started up on the road, or the sound of a dumpster being moved in the distance, bouncing off the trees. But the way the noise seemed so close, the way the car physically moved, and how quickly everything went silent after, that part still sticks with me. Every time I sleep in the car now, I make sure it's parked on solid ground with no loose gravel, and I always check the surroundings twice before I settle in. I still love camping, but sometimes when I wake up in the early hours and the night is quiet, I think about that strange rumbling noise rolling through the dark and the jolt that shook me awake. And I realize that even in the quietest places, you're never really alone out there. I used to live on the edge of a national park, deep in a stretch of country that barely showed up on a map. The cabin I stayed in sat about 4 miles from the main road, at the end of a dirt path that looked more like an animal trail than something made for cars. There was no plumbing, no power, and no phone signal. At night, the silence was so deep it almost hummed. You could hear every rustle in the grass, every branch shifting in the wind. When I first moved there, I told myself that isolation would be peaceful, a break from the constant noise of life. But that kind of silence starts to play tricks on your mind after a while. The property belonged to an older couple who only came up during the summer. They rented it out cheap to people working with the Park Service. My roommate at the time was an intern ranger, a city kid who thought roughing it meant camping in a state park with hot showers nearby. I'd grown up around woods and knew what it was like to live far from people. But even I wasn't ready for how empty this place felt. You could go days without seeing another human being. The first few weeks were uneventful. We spent our days hiking around the property, chopping wood, fetching water from a stream about 100 yards from the cabin. The nights were long, cold, and pitch black. Once the sun went down, the forest pressed against the cabin like a living thing. The air got heavy and every sound carried, and insects, owls, branches creaking. But after a while I started to notice a pattern in those sounds. It was the sound of footsteps. It began one night around midnight. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling trying to fall asleep when I heard something outside. A steady crunch of leaves and twigs moving slow, deliberate, like someone walking barefoot through the woods. The sound circled the cabin once, then stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening for anything else. Nothing, just silence after that. I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a pig. Out there that wasn't unusual, but then it kept happening. Almost every night around the same time, I'd hear the same slow steps moving just beyond the walls. Sometimes it sounded like they stopped right outside the window. I started keeping a flashlight next to me, but when I'd shine it through the glass, there'd be nothing there. Just empty woods and the dim outline of trees. The strange thing was that whatever it was never made the same sound twice in a row. Sometimes it stopped behind the cabin, sometimes near the front steps, sometimes off toward the trees behind the outhouse. Always moving slow, never running, never making any other noise. I told myself it had to be wildlife. There were plenty of animals that could sound like footsteps, raccoons, wild dogs, even big cats. But what bothered me was that the sound always stopped when I got up. It was like it knew I was awake. I'd sit there, flashlight in hand, listening to my own breathing, waiting for the noise to start again, but it never did until I tried to sleep. After about a week, I started sleeping in my car. The cabin didn't have a locking door, just a wooden latch that didn't even fit right. The owners didn't want us to install one, said it would ruin the old look of the place. I didn't care about the look. I wanted to feel safe. So every night I started parking my car about an acre away from the cabin, in a little clearing behind some pines. I figured if whatever was making those sounds came close, I'd hear it on the gravel or against the car. But even there, I started hearing the same thing, footsteps. Not close at first, on maybe a few 100 feet away. Then closer. Slow crunching in the dark, moving from the direction of the cabin toward where I was parked. I'd turn the engine on, flash the headlights into the trees, and again, nothing. No movement. No animals running. Just still wood staring back. The longer it went on, the more I started to notice small changes around the property. The woodpile beside the cabin looked different some mornings, like someone had moved pieces around. A few of our tools were missing. Not gone completely, but placed in weird spots, like 20 or 30 feet away from where they should be. Once I found a single boot print near the stream. It wasn't mine, and my roommate's shoes were smaller. The print looked fresh, made sometime in the early morning while the ground was still damp with dew. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking everything. It was easy to let fear take over when you lived that far out. My roommate didn't believe me. He laughed when I told him about the footsteps and said it was probably just an animal, or the wind shifting through the brush. But wind doesn't move like that, and animals don't stop dead silent the second you move. I told him he should start sleeping in his car too, but he brushed it off. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. One night I heard the footsteps again, closer than ever, and when I turned on my flashlight, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The outline of a man standing behind a tree about 50 feet away. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him. Tall, broad-shouldered, holding something long in his hand. The moment my light hit him, he stepped backward into the shadows and vanished. I packed my things the next morning and left. My roommate stayed. He said I was being paranoid. 2 weeks later, he called me. His voice was shaking. Someone had broken into the cabin while he was gone during the day. They didn't take much, just food, batteries, a few tools. A few days after that, it happened again. That's when he finally decided to install motion-triggered cameras around the property. When the footage came back, it showed something I still can't get out of my head. There was a man, probably in his late 40s or 50s, wearing dark clothes and carrying a long rifle. He'd hike up to the property just after sunset, hide in the brush, and watch the cabin for hours. Sometimes he'd move closer, crouching near the trees, staring through the windows. He wasn't hunting. He wasn't trespassing by accident. He was watching us. The footage was turned over to the Park Service and local police, but they never caught him. They said there were too many miles of wilderness, too many old trails he could have used. My roommate moved out not long after that. The cabin's still there, but no one rents it anymore. Sometimes I still think about those nights. The sound of footsteps circling the cabin, the way they stopped whenever I moved. It wasn't the woods playing tricks on me. Someone had been out there the whole time, waiting in the dark, watching. And the worst part is knowing that he's probably still out there, somewhere deep in those woods, walking slow, quiet, waiting for someone else to move in. I had taken a week off work and decided to spend it driving up the West Coast, stopping at small campgrounds near the water. I liked quiet places where I could hear the wind through the trees and the sound of waves not too far away. My back isn't in great shape, so I don't sleep on the ground anymore. I had turned the back of my car into a little sleeping space. I had a thick foam mattress that folded perfectly across the back seat, a sleeping bag, and small blackout covers for each window so I could sleep in privacy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was comfortable and felt safe. That night I camped at a small site just north of a coastal town. It was the kind of place that had only about 15 campsites, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. You could smell the salt in the air from the ocean a short walk away. The ground was soft and covered in pine needles. A few other campers were spread out across the area, a van, a couple of tents, and an old RV near the entrance. I parked my car under a tree, made sure my food was stored properly, and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly, and I remember the cool air sneaking in through the cracks of the window covers as I lay inside my sleeping bag, listening to the faint hum of crickets. I woke up once around midnight to shift my position. My lower back always got stiff after a few hours, so I stretched a little, then lay still again. The night was completely quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. I fell back asleep quickly. The next thing I remember was waking up to a strange sound early in the morning. At first I thought I was still dreaming. It was a deep rattling noise, like something heavy rolling over gravel. It came in bursts, not constant but uneven, like the wheels of a shopping cart moving across a rough parking lot. It was such an odd sound to hear out there in the woods that my half-awake mind couldn't make sense of it. I just lay there for a moment trying to figure out what could make a noise like that. Then I felt it. The car shook. Not a little tremor from the wind, but a real bump that made my head move against the pillow. It felt like something had hit the side of the vehicle, maybe from the rear. The whole frame gave a low metallic creak as it settled back into place. My heart started pounding instantly. I lay completely still, staring up at the ceiling of the car, my breath held. I thought maybe it was a person at first. Maybe someone had tripped over the bumper or leaned on the car accidentally. But the site next to me had been empty the night before, and I hadn't heard any footsteps or voices. The air outside was completely still, and that rolling, rumbling sound was fading but still there, moving past me, slow and heavy. I started unzipping the sleeping bag from the inside, but it caught halfway down. I fumbled with it, trying to keep quiet even though I wasn't sure why. The zipper teeth snagged on the fabric, and I had to wiggle it free before I could sit up. My adrenaline was spiking so hard that my fingers were shaking. I finally pushed the bag open and sat up, peering through the small gap in one of the window covers. There was nothing. The trees stood motionless in the dim morning light. The sky had that pale gray color that comes right before sunrise, and I could just barely make out the outlines of the picnic table, the fire ring, and the gravel parking pad. I didn't see anyone walking. No movement in the brush, no animal shapes in the distance. The sound had completely stopped. I stayed like that for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, waiting, trying to listen for anything. Nothing moved. The quiet was heavy and unnatural. I finally slid out of the sleeping bag, unlocked the doors as quietly as I could, and opened the back hatch just a little to peek outside. The air was cold and damp, the kind that clings to your skin and smells faintly like pine sap and ocean mist. I stepped out and circled the car, checking the ground. The dirt around the tires had deep impressions, wide, uneven, and heavy. They weren't tire marks. They looked more like something large had walked by and brushed against the car as it did. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints weren't clear enough to tell exactly what they belonged to, but they were big, and there were several of them leading off toward the tree line behind my sight. The edges were soft from the damp earth, but I could see where the weight had pressed the soil down deep. My mind started running through possibilities. I'd camped enough to know that bears were common in the region, especially near the coast. But the rumbling sound didn't fit. Bears walk softly. Even big ones can move quietly. That metallic, rolling, gravelly sound didn't sound like any animal movement I'd ever heard. I thought maybe it was a deer or elk rubbing against the car. But again, that didn't explain the sound either. I went over to where the prints disappeared into the trees. The underbrush was disturbed, branches bent, and a few patches of wet grass flattened. Whatever it was had definitely gone through there. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't fear in the sense of danger, more like confusion mixed with that instinct that tells you something isn't quite right. I kept scanning the woods for movement, but everything stayed still. I decided to wait until full daylight before packing up. I sat at the picnic table, drinking from my water bottle, still listening for that sound again. Nothing. Just birds starting to call as the sun came up. By the time the light fully filled the clearing, I walked back to the car to inspect it again. On the back bumper there was a smear, not a scratch exactly, but a faint muddy streak, like something had brushed past it with enough force to move the whole vehicle. I left the campground an hour later. I checked out at the small ranger station on the way out and told the ranger what happened, mostly because I wanted to know what kind of animal could bump a car like that. He said there were elk in the area, and sometimes they wandered through campgrounds at night, though he admitted it was rare for one to come that close. He also said bears occasionally nudged vehicles if they smelled food inside, but I hadn't had any in the car. I've thought about that morning many times since. The rumbling sound is what I can't get past. It was rhythmic, uneven, and deep, like the ground itself was vibrating. I've camped dozens of times after that in other places, and I've never heard anything like it again. It's probably something simple. Maybe an elk brushing past while a nearby truck started up on the road, or the sound of a dumpster being moved in the distance bouncing off the trees. But the way the noise seemed so close, the way the car physically moved, and how quickly everything went silent after, that part still sticks with me. Every time I sleep in the car now, I make sure it's parked on solid ground with no loose gravel, and I always check the surroundings twice before I settle in. I still love camping, but sometimes when I wake up in the early hours and the night is quiet, I think about that strange rumbling noise rolling through the dark and the jolt that shook me awake. And I realize that even in the quietest places, you're never really alone out there. Back in 2010, I had just finished a wilderness leadership course and felt like I needed to test myself. Really test myself. I wanted to see what I was capable of when there was no one else around. No instructors, no backup plan. No one to tell me what to do if things went bad. I had read about some natural hot springs in Colorado that only surfaced during the winter months. When the snow melted, the Colorado River would rise and completely submerge them. But in the winter, they were accessible if you were willing to hike out there. The idea of being in a place that remote, surrounded by nothing but frozen wilderness and silence, pulled at me in a way I can't fully explain. I packed my gear, drove out there, and parked at the edge of a rough dirt road that ended in a wide, empty expanse of BLM land. When I arrived, there was one person, a middle-aged woman who oversaw that section of land for the Bureau of Land Management. She had an old white truck and a radio clipped to her belt. She seemed used to solitude. She didn't ask many questions, just told me to write the date on my windshield every week when I came back to restock my supplies. so she'd know I was still alive. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later when I was alone out there, I'd think about that phrase, so she'd know I was still alive, and it would echo in my head in ways I didn't like. The hike to my spot was about 4 miles from where I parked. It wasn't an easy 4 miles either. It was rough terrain, cold and uneven. There were long patches of frozen mud, deep snow in some areas, and sections where the wind howled through the canyon so hard that I had to crouch down to keep my balance. By the time I got to the river, I was sweating through my jacket, even though the air temperature was somewhere in the teens. I found a spot close to the cliff that overlooked the river. The cliff dropped about 40 feet down to the water. From where I stood, I could see the faint steam of the hot springs curling up into the cold air, like thin, ghostly smoke. I decided that would be my camp. I liked the height. I could see both directions down the canyon, and I figured if any animal came my way, I'd have time to react. The cliff also made me feel oddly safer. My mind played out the scenario. If a bear came into camp, my last-ditch plan was to jump. 40 feet down was no joke, but I figured I might survive the fall into the snow, then crawl toward the hot springs before I froze. That plan sounds stupid when you're safe and warm, but when you're deep in the wild and everything out there is bigger, hungrier, and stronger than you, crazy ideas start to sound practical. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time exploring the area, gathering firewood, boiling water from the river, and hiking down to the hot springs every evening. The springs were the only comfort out there. Sitting in that steaming water while the air bit at my face was pure relief. Everything around me was quiet except for the occasional gust of wind or a bird somewhere far off. The sky was so open and clear it felt endless. But as soon as the sun dipped below the cliffs, the cold moved in fast like something alive. Nights were the hardest. The stillness out there was heavy, almost oppressive. Every creak of the trees, every rustle in the brush sounded close. I kept my food locked in a bear canister far from camp, but that didn't stop the thoughts. Bears were supposed to be sleeping through winter, but not all of them hibernate the same way. Some just slow down, and if one was awake, it meant it was desperate and hungry, the worst kind of bear to run into. One night, around my 5th or 6th day, I was lying in my sleeping bag listening to the wind drag across the nylon of my tent. It was just before dawn, that gray-blue time when everything is still and the cold feels sharper. I remember being half awake, drifting between sleep and that anxious awareness that comes from being alone for too long. Then I heard it, a heavy rhythmic sound outside my tent. It was faint at first, like something large moving through the snow. I froze, the sound grew louder. It wasn't wind or falling branches, it was steps. Heavy ones, crunching through the hard snow, slow and deliberate. My first thought was bear. My heart started pounding so hard that I could feel it shaking my chest. I lay completely still, gripping my sleeping bag. The steps stopped right next to my tent. I could hear breathing, deep, wet breaths with a low grunt between them. The air inside my tent felt thin. I tried to tell myself not to move, not to make a sound. Then came another sound, a snuffling noise like it was sniffing the fabric of the tent. I could see the faint bulge of movement through the thin nylon. I remember thinking this was it, that my plan about the cliff and the river might actually have to happen. It moved around my tent slowly, its steps heavy, the breathing steady and close. Then to my horror, I heard more than one set of footsteps. My mind went blank. I didn't know what could make that kind of sound. Bears usually don't move in groups. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, but it was probably less than 5 minutes. The noises eventually moved away, but they were still nearby. I could hear soft grunts and the sound of snow being disturbed. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The cold air slapped me in the face, and I scanned the clearing. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, so everything had that dim blue tone, but I could make out shapes moving about 20 feet away. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Then slowly the shapes took form. Tall, lean bodies, legs bending at odd angles, wide heads with dark antlers. A whole herd of elk. There must have been 10 or 12 of them wandering through the snow, their breath steaming in the cold air. The relief hit me so hard I almost laughed, but the fear hadn't left yet. My body still felt like it was waiting for something to happen. I watched them for a long time as they moved through the clearing, stopping to dig at the snow for food. They were close enough that I could hear their hooves crunching and their occasional snorts. When the first light of the sun touched their backs, their coat shimmered slightly with frost. It was beautiful, but I was still shaking. I didn't go back to sleep that morning. I sat outside the tent, staring at the trees, trying to calm myself. It was strange. I had gone out there to find peace and solitude, but all I found was how fragile I really was in a place like that. Nature didn't care if I was scared or alone. It didn't even know I existed. I stayed out there for another week, but I never slept quite the same after that night. Every sound kept me half awake. I'd find myself listening for footsteps that never came. When I finally packed up and hiked back to my truck, I wrote the date on my windshield like the lady had asked, then sat in the driver's seat for a long time, hands shaking slightly, trying to process how something as simple as a herd of elk could have made me feel that close to death. That trip taught me something I didn't expect. Out there, it's not about bravery or toughness. It's about respect. For the land, for the things that live on it, and for the fact that no matter how much gear or training you have, you're still just a fragile thing in a massive, indifferent world. I went out there to prove something to myself. What I proved was how small I really was. Back in 2010, I had just finished a wilderness leadership course and felt like I needed to test myself. Really test myself. I wanted to see what I was capable of when there was no one else around. No instructors, no backup plan. No one to tell me what to do if things went bad. I had read about some natural hot springs in Colorado that only surfaced during the winter months. When the snow melted, the Colorado River would rise and completely submerge them, but in the winter they were accessible if you were willing to hike out there. The idea of being in a place that remote, surrounded by nothing but frozen wilderness and silence, pulled at me in a way I can't fully explain. I packed my gear, drove out there, and parked at the edge of a rough dirt road that ended in a wide, empty expanse of BLM land. When I arrived, there was one person, a middle-aged woman who oversaw that section of land for the Bureau of Land Management. She had an old white truck and a radio clipped to her belt. She seemed used to solitude. She didn't ask many questions, just told me to write the date on my windshield every week when I came back to restock my supplies, so she'd know I was still alive. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later, when I was alone out there, I'd think about that phrase, so she'd know I was still alive, and it would echo in my head in ways I didn't like. The hike to my spot was about 4 miles from where I parked. It wasn't an easy 4 miles either. It was rough terrain, cold and uneven. There were long patches of frozen mud, deep snow in some areas, and sections where the wind howled through the canyon so hard that I had to crouch down to keep my balance. By the time I got to the river, I was sweating through my jacket, even though the air temperature was somewhere in the teens. I found a spot close to the cliff that overlooked the river. The cliff dropped about 40 feet down to the water. From where I stood, I could see the faint steam of the hot springs curling up into the cold air, like thin ghostly smoke. I decided that would be my camp. I liked the height. I could see both directions down the canyon, and I figured if any animal came my way, I'd have time to react. The cliff also made me feel oddly safer. My mind played out the scenario. If a bear came into camp, my last-ditch plan was to jump. 40 feet down was no joke, but I figured I might survive the fall into the snow, then crawl toward the hot springs before I froze. That plan sounds stupid when you're safe and warm, but when you're deep in the wild and everything out there is bigger, hungrier, and stronger than you, crazy ideas start to sound practical. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time exploring the area, gathering firewood, boiling water from the river, and hiking down to the hot springs every evening. The springs were the only comfort out there. Sitting in that steaming water while the air bit at my face was pure relief. Everything around me was quiet except for the occasional gust of wind or a bird somewhere far off. The sky was so open and clear it felt endless. But as soon as the sun dipped below the cliffs, the cold moved in fast like something alive. Nights were the hardest. The stillness out there was heavy, almost oppressive. Every creak of the trees, every rustle in the brush sounded close. I kept my food locked in a bear canister far from camp, but that didn't stop the thoughts. Bears were supposed to be sleeping through winter, but not all of them hibernate the same way. Some just slow down, and if one was awake, it meant it was desperate and hungry. The worst kind of bear to run into. One night, around my 5th or 6th day, I was lying in my sleeping bag listening to the wind drag across the nylon of my tent. It was just before dawn, that gray-blue time when everything is still and the cold feels sharper. I remember being half awake, drifting between sleep and that anxious awareness that comes from being alone for too long. Then I heard it, a heavy rhythmic sound outside my tent. It was faint at first, like something large moving through the snow. I froze, the sound grew louder. It wasn't wind or falling branches, it was steps. Heavy ones, crunching through the hard snow, slow and deliberate. My first thought was bear. My heart started pounding so hard that I could feel it shaking my chest. I lay completely still, gripping my sleeping bag. The steps stopped right next to my tent. I could hear breathing, deep wet breaths with a low grunt between them. The air inside my tent felt thin. I tried to tell myself not to move, not to make a sound. Then came another sound, a snuffling noise like it was sniffing the fabric of the tent. I could see the faint bulge of movement through the thin nylon. I remember thinking this was it, that my plan about the cliff and the river might actually have to happen. It moved around my tent slowly, its steps heavy, the breathing steady and close. Then, to my horror, I heard more than one set of footsteps. My mind went blank. I didn't know what could make that kind of sound. Bears usually don't move in groups. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, but it was probably less than 5 minutes. The noises eventually moved away, but they were still nearby. I could hear soft grunts and the sound of snow being disturbed. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The cold air slapped me in the face and I scanned the clearing. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, so everything had that dim blue tone, but I could make out shapes moving about 20 feet away. At first I couldn't process what I was seeing. Then slowly the shapes took form. Tall, lean bodies, legs bending at odd angles, wide heads with dark antlers. A whole herd of elk. There must have been 10 or 12 of them, wandering through the snow, their breath steaming in the cold air. The relief hit me so hard I almost laughed, but the fear hadn't left yet. My body still felt like it was waiting for something to happen. I watched them for a long time as they moved through the clearing, stopping to dig at the snow for food. They were close enough that I could hear their hooves crunching and their occasional snorts. When the first light of the sun touched their backs, their coats shimmered slightly with frost. It was beautiful, but I was still shaking. I didn't go back to sleep that morning. I sat outside the tent staring at the trees, trying to calm myself. It was strange. I had gone out there to find peace and solitude, but all I found was how fragile I really was in a place like that. Nature didn't care if I was scared or alone. It didn't even know I existed. I stayed out there for another week, but I never slept quite the same after that night. Every sound kept me half awake. I'd find myself listening for footsteps that never came. When I finally packed up and hiked back to my truck, I wrote the date on my windshield like the lady had asked, then sat in the driver's seat for a long time, hands shaking slightly, trying to process how something as simple as a herd of elk could have made me feel that close to death. That trip taught me something I didn't expect. Out there, it's not about bravery or toughness. It's about respect for the land, for the things that live on it, and for the fact that no matter how much gear or training you have, you're still just a fragile thing in a massive, indifferent world. I went out there to prove something to myself. What I proved was how small I really was. I used to be part of a group similar to the Scouts, and we spent a lot of time out in the woods doing camping trips, survival training, and outdoor games. I had been a leader for a few years, and by the time this happened, I was responsible for the younger group, kids between 8 and 10 years old. Most of the time, the weird things that happened in the woods could be explained easily. Sounds in the dark, things moving in the brush, footprints we didn't make. It all usually had some kind of normal explanation behind it. But there's one night from one of those camps that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. That year we were camping on a new terrain, a large one we hadn't used before. Normally before the kids arrived, we'd explore the entire area so we could map out any dangerous spots. Steep drops, loose ground, old fencing, things like that. But this place was far too big. The forest stretched out in all directions, and even after 2 days of scouting before the camp began, we'd only covered a fraction of it. The terrain was rough, the woods were uneven, and there were several open stretches of land between thicker areas of trees. On the third night of camp, it was time for what we called the night game. It was a tradition in our camps. The idea was to send the kids in small groups through a trail in the woods with checkpoints where they had to complete little tasks, collect objects, find signs, solve something simple. The older leaders would dress up as monsters and hide along the route to scare them. It was harmless fun. We always made sure the area was safe. And even though the game took place at night, we had first aid kits, walkie-talkies, and a few adults stationed around. That night, the sky was moonless. The forest was darker than usual. When you turned off your flashlight, you couldn't even see your hand right in front of your face. It was the kind of dark that makes your mind play tricks on you, where every rustle or shadow feels alive. I was assigned to move between a few checkpoints to make sure the route was clear, and to keep an eye out for wandering kids. While running between 2 checkpoints, I came across an open section of the forest. The ground there was mostly covered with thin grass and small plants, and the trees were spaced far apart, leaving long gaps where the moonlight should have hit. But that night, there was no moonlight at all. The air was still heavy and dry. It was the perfect area for me to hide and jump out when a group passed, but there wasn't much cover except for the trees themselves. I didn't want to use my flashlight because the kids could easily spot me from a distance, so I just crouched in the dark, letting my eyes adjust. After about 5 minutes, I thought I saw movement, a shadow roughly my height, darting between the trees ahead of me. It was fast, silent. I assumed it was another leader moving to a better hiding spot. But when I turned on my flashlight to check, the beam just lit up empty trees and the rough bark of the trunks. Nothing there. I shrugged it off as my imagination. A while later, it happened again. This time I saw the shadow move left to right, maybe 15 meters away. Same size, same quick movement. I turned the light on again, but again there was nothing. No crunching footsteps, no sound at all, just dead quiet. I felt a strange unease, but I told myself I was overreacting. The game was almost over anyway. When the game was nearing its end, I saw that same shape again. Only this time it wasn't moving. It was standing still near one of the trees about 20 meters away. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out a faint outline, a person standing motionless. Thinking it was one of the other leaders waiting to jump out at the last group, I walked toward it. I raised my flashlight, still keeping it off because I didn't want to ruin the game for the kids if they were nearby. As I got closer, I flicked the light on. That's when I froze. The beam hit what looked like a man standing against the tree. He was wearing something rough and torn that looked like an old burlap sack. His head was covered with several white plastic bags tied together, like someone had made a crude mask out of trash. The light caught the edges of the bags and they rustled slightly in the breeze. His bare feet were half sunk into the dirt, and his skin, or what I could see of it on his arms and legs, was caked with dried mud and something darker. His posture was stiff, his hands twisted in a strange claw-like way near his chest. At first I thought it had to be one of the leaders playing a prank, maybe trying to scare me instead of the kids. But something about it didn't fit. The silence, the smell, the way my chest tightened instantly, it felt wrong. My flashlight beam trembled slightly as I adjusted it, and that's when I noticed he was making a sound, a dull, rhythmic knocking. It took me a few seconds to realize he was hitting his head against the tree. Not hard, but steady, a wet, muffled thud every few seconds. He didn't move his arms, didn't flinch, just the sound of his head bumping the bark. I stood there, maybe 10 meters away, and the air around me felt heavier by the second. My instincts were screaming that something was off, that I needed to get away. But part of me still thought this was a prank, that if I ran, I'd just be the idiot who got scared too easily. I took one small step forward. That's when he stopped. He turned his head slowly, the plastic bags crinkling with the motion. Even through the poor light, I could see the outline of his face pressing against the thin plastic underneath. His body twitched slightly, then he started walking toward me. I didn't wait to see anything else. I turned and ran. I didn't even care if I tripped. My legs moved faster than they ever had, the branches whipping against my arms as I tore through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear the sound of footsteps, bare feet slapping against dirt, fast, uneven, but close enough that I knew he was running too. I didn't dare look back. Every ounce of focus I had was on getting back to camp without breaking my neck. When I burst out of the tree line into the open area near camp, I didn't stop running until I reached the tents and the light of the campfire. Every leader was already there, the kids sitting in groups eating snacks after the game. I checked every face, every costume. No one was missing. No one was wearing anything like that sack outfit. They all looked at me, confused by my expression, and I just told them they'd given me a good scare. They laughed it off. I forced myself to do the same, even though my hands were still shaking. The next morning after breakfast, I told one of the older leaders I wanted to check the area where I'd seen the person. Part of me wanted to believe it was some local playing around. Part of me just wanted proof that it was nothing serious. We went together with our flashlights and walked the same trail in daylight. It looked completely normal. But when we reached the tree where I'd seen him hitting his head, I stopped. Something dark was nailed to the bark about eye level. It was a rabbit, skinned, half decomposed, nailed right through its body. The smell was awful. The fur around the edges was matted with dried blood, and flies were buzzing all over it. We both stepped back immediately. We called the local police. 2 officers came, took a look, asked us some questions, and after a short while they brushed it off. They said it was probably some local teenagers or another camping group trying to mess with us. The way they reacted made it seem like they'd seen this kind of thing before. They didn't take notes for long, didn't collect anything, just told us to stay on the marked trails and keep an eye out for suspicious people. After that, we didn't notice anything strange for the rest of the camp. No more figures in the woods, no more shadows. Everything went back to normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about that man in the sack and plastic bags. I've told myself over and over that it must have been some sick prank. Maybe a local with a twisted sense of humor, or someone high on something wandering around the woods. That's what makes the most sense. But every time I remember how quiet that forest was, how his head moved against the tree, how he started running the moment he turned toward me, it never feels like a prank. It feels like I stumbled into something that I was never supposed to see, and even though I tell myself it was probably nothing, I still think about that plastic bag face every time I'm in the woods after dark. I used to be part of a youth outdoor group, something similar to the Scouts. We spent most weekends out in the woods, camping, hiking, building fires, learning how to survive in the wild. Weird things happened sometimes, but they were usually easy to explain. Strange noises, eyes reflecting in the dark, sudden winds, trees creaking like footsteps. Stuff that made your heart race until you realized it was nothing. But one night during a camp when I was leading the 8 to 10-year-old group, something happened that I still think about almost every day. It wasn't supernatural, at least I don't think it was, but it was one of the most disturbing things I've ever experienced. That particular summer, we set up camp on a new terrain. The area was massive, way bigger than the places we usually stayed. Normally, before the kids arrived, we'd scout the land so we could mark safe zones and dangerous spots, old wells, steep drops, poison ivy patches, and so on. But this time, the land was too big to check fully. The camp was surrounded by thick forest that seemed endless. We marked a few trails, cleared space for tents, and decided to trust the rest of it. Looking back, that was probably a mistake. One of our traditions was the night game. It was a scary activity we did every camp. The kids had to move from checkpoint to checkpoint in the dark, completing small challenges while we, the leaders, dressed up as monsters or creatures and tried to scare them. It was harmless fun, meant to get their adrenaline pumping. That night we split into groups, some guarding checkpoints, others hiding along the trails. I wore a dark hoodie and a mask, planning to jump out at the kids when they passed. The forest was darker than usual that night. The moon was barely visible behind the clouds, and the trees seemed to absorb what little light there was. I had a flashlight, but I didn't use it much because it would give away my position. I moved along the trail between checkpoints looking for a better spot to hide. I came across a part of the forest that opened up a little, less undergrowth, more open ground. It was perfect. You could move quickly there, but it also meant there weren't many places to hide besides behind the trees. I crouched low and waited. At first, everything was normal. I could hear the faint laughter and screams of kids in the distance. But after a while, I started seeing movement. Quick, dark shapes in the corner of my eye. It looked like a shadow darting between the trees. I assumed it was one of the other leaders moving to another spot, so I ignored it. But the longer I stayed there, the more I noticed it. A shape about my size moving silently across the open space. Every time I turned my light toward it, there was nothing there. The forest went completely still, and I would feel that heavy kind of silence that presses against your ears. I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been out there long enough to know that the mind plays tricks when you're standing alone in the dark. The game was nearing its end when I saw it again. This time, not moving. I could see the faint outline of a person standing near a tree about 20 or 30 meters away. My first thought was that it was one of the other leaders waiting to scare the kids, so I started walking toward them. I lifted my flashlight but kept it low so it wouldn't ruin my night vision. The closer I got, the stranger it looked. The person was dressed in something rough, like a burlap sack that was torn in several places. Their head was wrapped in white plastic bags tied together in a way that didn't make any sense. I stopped walking and felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The air around me seemed heavier. Something about the way that figure was standing, too still, too rigid, felt wrong. I stood there frozen, trying to process what I was looking at. Then I heard this faint knocking sound, a hollow rhythm like wood tapping against wood. It came from the direction of the figure. My first thought was that maybe he was knocking on the tree for some reason. I took a few steps closer, my boots crunching softly on the dirt. The sound became clearer, sharper. It wasn't knocking. It was the sound of someone repeatedly hitting their head against the tree trunk. A dull thud over and over. The figure was slightly hunched, and each impact made his body twitch. That's when I noticed his feet, bare, pale in the dim light, and his hands hanging weirdly stiff at his sides like claws. His skin looked like it was covered in dried mud, cracked and crusted. A strange panic started to build in my chest. I told myself it had to be one of the leaders playing an elaborate prank, maybe trying to scare me for fun. But as I stood there, I realized that none of the other leaders had mentioned anything like this, and the way that person was moving didn't seem like acting. It was too erratic, too disturbing. My instincts screamed at me to back away. Before I could move, the figure stopped. Slowly, almost mechanically, it turned its head toward me. The plastic bags around its face rustled slightly. I couldn't see eyes or features, just the faint outline of a head turning. Then it started walking toward me. I didn't think. I just ran. Every nerve in my body fired at once, pure fear pushing me through the dark. I didn't dare look back. Branches snapped under my feet. Trees whipped past me, and I nearly tripped several times. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, but I didn't know if they were real or just in my head. I ran until I saw the dim light of the campfire through the trees, and then I didn't stop until I was surrounded by other leaders and kids. Everyone who could have been out there was already back at camp. They were laughing, talking, taking off their masks. There was no time for anyone to have changed clothes or gotten there before me. I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen, so I said nothing more that night. I barely slept. Every sound outside the tent made my body tense. The next morning after breakfast, I couldn't shake the feeling. I convinced another leader to go with me to check the area. We followed the trail until I recognized the spot. In the daylight, it didn't look nearly as threatening. The tree where I'd seen the figure was just an ordinary tree, tall and old with bark peeling near the base. But as we got closer, the smell hit us first. A foul, decaying stench that turned my stomach. Then we saw it. A dead rabbit nailed to the trunk, its skin peeled away and hanging loose. The wood around it was stained dark. The sight froze us both in place. We called the police. They arrived about an hour later, walked around a bit, took a few photos, and didn't seem surprised. One of them said it was probably a prank from local teenagers, or maybe another camping group messing around. The way they acted made it seem like this wasn't the first time they'd seen something like it. After they left, I kept staring at that tree, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen last night was part of that same prank. Some disturbed person doing it for attention or a laugh. We stayed on the site for 2 more nights. Nothing else happened. No strange noises, no figures in the dark. But every time I walked past the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just far enough away to watch, hidden among the trunks. I still tell myself it was just a prank, some local messing around. But deep down, part of me knows that the way that man moved, the sound of his head hitting that tree, the sight of that dead rabbit, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like someone who didn't want us there. And to this day, whenever I think about camping again, I can still hear that dull, hollow knocking sound echoing in the back of my mind. I had been planning that camping trip along the Mogollon Rim for weeks. I wanted to be away from everything for a while, just me and my dog, Hunter. The rim has always been one of my favorite places in Arizona. Tall pines stretching out for miles, deep canyons that seem to swallow sound, and the kind of silence that feels alive. I drove out there on a Friday afternoon, the bed of my truck packed with a tent, some basic gear, and enough food to last 2 days. It was early fall, cool enough at night that you could see your breath if you exhaled near the fire. I found a clearing off a narrow dirt road, maybe a mile from the nearest established campsite. I liked spots like that, the ones where it felt like nobody had been there in months. The place opened out to a view of the canyon edge, and there were thick clusters of manzanita and juniper bushes nearby, perfect for blocking the wind. I parked the truck facing back toward the dirt road just in case I needed to leave quickly. That's a habit I picked up after years of camping. You learn not to park nose first into the woods. I set up the tent while the sun dropped behind the trees, that orange light flickering through the branches. Hunter trotted around sniffing everything, tail up, full of energy. He was a medium-sized mutt, about 60 pounds, and usually brave about everything. Coyotes, raccoons, other campers, he'd bark and growl like he owned the forest. I started a small fire once the tent was up, laid out my chair, and cooked some sausages over the flames. It was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the soft rustling of pine needles when the wind moved through. After eating, I leaned back and stared at the stars. The sky was clear that night, so clear it looked endless. You could see the faint glow of distant planes crossing overhead. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. That kind of quiet always hits me hard out there. It's both relaxing and unnerving because you realize how far away you really are from everything. It was close to 10 p.m. when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like something brushing against dry branches behind one of the bushes about 30 feet from where I was sitting. Hunter lifted his head from where he was lying next to me and made a low sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, but not relaxed either. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam didn't catch anything. The bushes swayed a little, but the wind had died down earlier, so it didn't feel right. Normally, Hunter would have run toward it or barked, but instead, he just crouched low and started to whimper. That was what made me uneasy. He never whimpered. His ears were flat and his tail tucked in tight, and he kept glancing between me and the dark space beyond the firelight. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was a deer or some smaller animal moving through. I tossed a couple of pieces of wood onto the fire, the sparks jumping up as the flames grew stronger. The light pushed further out into the trees, but beyond that circle of firelight, everything was pitch black. A few minutes passed. The forest went dead quiet. That was the worst part, when even the insects seemed to stop. I sat there listening, the hair on my arm standing up. Then I heard it again, but from the other side this time, closer to the tent. It was the soft crunch of something stepping on dry pine needles. Hunter got up immediately and went to the tent, scratching at the flap like he wanted in. I'd never seen him act like that before. He was scared of something out there. I picked up a few small rocks and tossed them toward the sound. Each one landed with a dull thud, but nothing moved or made a sound back. I stood there for a moment, my flashlight aimed out toward the darkness, waiting for any sign of eyes or motion. Nothing. Just the endless blackness of the woods and the sound of my own breathing. That's when it hit me that I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from anyone, with only a thin layer of nylon between me and whatever was moving out there. I fed a few bigger logs into the fire so it would burn bright for a while, and then climbed into the tent with Hunter. He immediately curled up against me, shaking slightly. I zipped the tent up and lay there in the dark, listening to the fire pop outside. Every so often I'd hear faint crunching sounds, slow and measured, like something circling the camp but keeping its distance. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. At one point, the fire must have started to die down because the light faded through the tent wall. I could tell because the shadows grew softer and the air got colder. I didn't want to get up to add more wood. The noises had stopped by then, but I had this gut feeling that if I opened the tent I'd regret it. So I stayed still, lying there with my heart pounding so hard it felt like the whole tent could hear it. I must have drifted off eventually, though I don't remember falling asleep. When I woke up it was dawn. That early light was pushing through the trees and the air had that cold, damp smell that comes after a night in the woods. Hunter was asleep next to me, completely calm again, like nothing had happened. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire was down to ashes and the forest was quiet again, but in a normal way this time. Birds chirping, small things rustling through the underbrush. I stretched and then walked over to the area behind the bushes where I'd first heard the sounds. The ground was covered with layers of old pine needles, but some patches were clear where something heavy had moved. I crouched down and saw the prints right away, big paw marks wide with deep indentations. I followed them around the camp and it became clear that whatever it was had circled my tent more than once during the night. There were spots where it had paused, maybe watching from just beyond the firelight. I'd seen enough animal tracks in my life to recognize them. They were mountain lion tracks, large, fresh, and close. One of them was no more than 10 feet from where I'd been sitting by the fire. My stomach tightened when I realized how close it must have been while I was tossing those rocks. If I'd gone out there with my flashlight to check, there's a good chance I wouldn't have made it back to the tent. Hunter came up beside me and sniffed at the prints, tail low but calm now. I gave him a pat on the side, thankful he hadn't barked that night. Barking might have made it feel threatened. The thought of that big cat stalking around the camp, watching us in silence, sent a cold wave through me even in the morning sun. I packed up quickly after that. I didn't feel like making breakfast or staying for another night. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore, and they felt like something was keeping watch. Before leaving, I took one last look at the clearing, at the faint ring of paw prints fading into the trees. It was strange to think how close danger had been, how easily it could have gone bad if I'd made one wrong move. Driving back down that dirt road, I kept thinking about how the forest always looks calm from a distance, but when you're out there alone, it reminds you just how small you really are. That night I learned that lesson better than ever. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is nothing. Just stay still, keep the fire burning, and wait for the dark to pass. I worked as a park ranger in Wyoming for almost 7 years, most of it spent patrolling the backcountry areas of Bighorn National Forest. It was one of those jobs that felt peaceful on the surface, but deep down you always knew something could go wrong at any moment. The forest stretched for miles, and there were parts of it so remote that even rescue helicopters couldn't easily reach. You had to be self-sufficient, calm, and patient. I used to love the silence until I learned what it could hide. One summer, I was assigned to a 3-day solo patrol near Shell Canyon, a steep and heavily wooded area that had a mix of rocky cliffs, waterfalls, and thick pine forests. My task was routine: check on some damaged signage, record evidence of erosion along a hiking trail, and log any animal activity near the campsite zones. The place was beautiful but isolated. No cell service, no nearby rangers, just me, a radio, my truck, and miles of wilderness. The first day was easy. I spent most of it hiking between trail markers and updating notes. I saw deer, a few elk, and the usual signs of black bears. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and damp earth. I camped near a small creek where I could hear the water moving all night. Everything was normal. The second day started fine, but changed quickly. Around noon, I came across what looked like an old campsite deep off trail. There were rusted cans, a few torn tarps tangled in the roots of a tree, and a fire pit filled with old, half-burned trash. I logged it in my report, but what caught my attention was a small pile of bones next to it. They were small, maybe animal bones, but the way they were arranged bothered me. Someone had stacked them neatly in a small pyramid, like they'd been placed intentionally. I told myself it was probably just a hunter messing around or some curious hiker, but the feeling in my stomach didn't agree. It was too deliberate, too strange. That night, I camped about a mile away. I cooked a small meal, checked my gear, and made sure my radio was still working. The forest was silent except for the wind. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of branches snapping somewhere nearby. It wasn't close enough to be a threat, but close enough to make me alert. I listened for a few minutes. Then nothing, just the wind again. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or an elk moving through the brush, but it took me a long time to fall back asleep. By the third day, I was ready to wrap things up early and head back. I wanted to check one last section of trail that ran along a cliff edge above the canyon. When I got there, I noticed something odd, a narrow side path leading down toward the base of the cliff. It wasn't on any of our maps. The dirt was disturbed like someone had walked there recently. I decided to follow it just to make sure it wasn't a new illegal campsite or dumping spot. The path was rough and steep. I had to grab branches and roots to keep from sliding. After about 10 minutes, I reached a small flat area halfway down the slope. There were signs of another camp, an old sleeping bag torn open and weathered from rain, and a few personal items scattered around. A lighter, a shoe, a broken watch. Everything was filthy and looked like it had been there for years. But what froze me was a dark patch on a flat rock nearby. It wasn't fresh, but it looked like dried blood. I took photos, logged the coordinates, and backed out carefully. My boots slipped on the dirt more than once. It took me almost an hour to climb back up. When I reached the top, I stopped to catch my breath and noticed something strange. Footprints. They weren't mine. They came from the opposite direction, leading to the same path I had just taken. I didn't remember seeing them earlier. They were fresh, still clear in the dirt, heading down the slope. I didn't want to believe what that meant. Maybe someone had come through while I was down there. Maybe another ranger, but no one was scheduled in that area. My stomach felt tight, my throat dry. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. No sound, no movement. I started walking fast, almost jogging back toward my truck. The forest suddenly felt different, heavier. Every sound made me turn my head. When I reached my camp from the previous night, it was a mess. My tent had been ripped open. Not by an animal, I could tell by the way it was torn. My pack was dumped out, food gone, paper scattered. My radio, which I'd left inside, was missing. The tracks around the camp were the same boot prints I'd seen on the trail. Someone had gone through my things while I was down at the cliff. I couldn't explain how they knew I was gone or why they waited until then, but it was clear they'd been watching me. I grabbed what was left, my map, my sidearm, and my remaining gear, and started back toward the truck without stopping. It was still a few miles away, and I pushed through the forest as fast as I could. Several times I thought I heard someone moving behind me, branches snapping, slow, deliberate footsteps that would stop whenever I stopped. The forest was too quiet. Even the birds were gone. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the service road. My truck was parked at the trailhead just where I'd left it, but as I got closer, I noticed the driver's side door was cracked open. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I looked inside, the seat was wet with mud that didn't match my boots. The ignition keys were still in the cup holder, but my logbook, maps, and the radio I'd kept in the glove box were gone. Whoever it was, they'd beaten me back. I didn't waste time thinking. I slammed the door, locked it, started the engine, and drove until I reached the ranger station, 30 miles away. I didn't stop once. When I got there, I reported everything, the campsites, the footprints, the missing gear. They sent another ranger team to check it out the next morning. They found the sites I described, the bones, the bloodstain, and my shredded tent. But nothing else. No sign of anyone. My missing radio and papers never turned up. The footprints were gone too, washed out by overnight rain. The official report labeled it, possible human interference, unidentified individual. They told me not to worry, that hikers sometimes got strange out there, living off-grid, scavenging, avoiding contact. But I knew what I felt. Someone had been tracking me the entire time. A few months later, I transferred to a different section of the forest. I still work as a ranger, but I never camp alone anymore. I keep my truck locked even in the middle of nowhere, and I check every footprint I see. The forest still looks calm and quiet, but I know better now. It's not the wildlife you need to be afraid of out there. It's the people who decide to stay hidden, watching from the trees, waiting for you to forget they exist. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana for a few years, and there's one stretch of time I still think about every time I drive through the backcountry alone. It wasn't anything supernatural, no ghosts or myths, just a situation that started as normal work and turned into something I still can't shake off. It happened during late October, just before the park shut down most of the campsites for the winter. The temperature had started dropping into the 30s at night, and most of the tourists were gone. That time of year, the forest feels hollow. The trails are quiet, the lakes are covered with thin sheets of ice, and every sound carries further than it should. My job that week was to check a series of remote fire towers and cabins before the first snow came in. I was stationed at a small ranger outpost about 20 miles from the nearest paved road. The forest around it was endless pine, thick undergrowth, and steep ridges. I was alone except for a small ATV and a park truck that could barely make it through the old dirt trails. The first few days went smoothly. I checked trail markers, restocked emergency boxes, and made sure no hunters had left trash or fires behind. But on the fourth day, I had to inspect a tower near a section of the park called Miller's Ridge. It was one of the least visited areas, about 12 miles from the outpost by trail, though most people never saw it because the road leading there had washed out a few years back. I loaded the ATV early that morning with fuel, food, and my toolkit. The ride out was rough, full of fallen branches and rocks. I stopped a few times to clear debris. About halfway there, I noticed fresh tire tracks on the muddy ground. They weren't from the Park Service. Our trucks used different tread patterns. These were from an older pickup, narrow and uneven. I figured it was some hunter ignoring the closure signs, which wasn't uncommon, so I made a note to check it out later. When I got to Miller's Ridge, the fire tower stood tall but worn down. The steps creaked under my boots, and the wind cut through the metal frame hard enough to make it whistle. Inside, everything looked normal, just dusty, a few bird droppings, some empty water bottles from the last crew who'd stayed there. I ran through the checklist, took some photos, and was about to leave when I saw smoke through the trees to the north. It wasn't far, maybe half a mile away. It didn't look like a wildfire, more like a small campfire. Since the area was supposed to be closed, I drove that way to check. The ground got rougher, and soon I had to leave the ATV and go on foot. The smoke led me down a slope toward a small clearing surrounded by thick spruce. When I got close enough, I saw the remains of a fire, still warm but covered in dirt like someone had put it out quickly. There were empty cans, a half-burnt sleeping bag, and a few footprints heading deeper into the woods. What bothered me was that the prints weren't leading back toward the main trail. They went into a dense part of the forest where there were no marked paths. I followed them for a while, maybe half a mile before they disappeared on rocky ground. That's when I noticed something else, a faint smell of rot. Not animal rot, but that sickly sweet smell that clings to your clothes and doesn't fade. I checked around and found what looked like an old hunting blind, made from wood and camo netting. Inside were a few broken beer bottles, an old cooler, and a pile of deer bones. Except one of the bones wasn't from a deer. It was too thick, too round. It looked like a human femur. I froze for a while, trying to make sense of it. There were no missing person reports in that section recently, at least none that I'd heard about. But it was old enough that the bone was clean and dry. I took photos, marked the GPS coordinates, and started heading back. The forest was dead quiet now. No birds, no wind, just that constant feeling that someone was watching me. I kept my hand near the bear spray on my belt, though I wasn't thinking about animals anymore. When I got back to the ATV, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Someone had gone through my gear. My pack was open, the food and first aid kit tossed aside, and the map was missing. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. I tried to convince myself it could have been an animal. Maybe a raccoon, but raccoons don't take folded paper maps. I started the ATV and rode back toward the outpost as fast as I could. It was late afternoon, the light fading through the branches, and every sound made me jump. About a mile from the cabin, I had to slow down for a fallen tree across the trail. It wasn't there that morning. The cut looked fresh, clean, like it was done with a chainsaw. I didn't carry one, and no one else should have been out there. I managed to push the smaller branches aside and squeeze through, but I didn't stop again. By the time I reached the outpost, it was almost dark. That night I locked the door and checked every window. The forest outside was silent, just the occasional creak of trees in the wind. Around midnight I heard movement near the truck, slow steps on gravel. I turned off my lantern and looked through the small front window. I could just barely make out a figure near the edge of the clearing. No flashlight, no headlamp, just standing there. After a few seconds it turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. At first light I radioed my supervisor and reported what I found. The campsite, the bone, and the possible intruder. It took nearly 3 hours for the nearest unit to reach me. By the time they arrived, whoever had been out there was long gone. We went back to the clearing together, but most of the stuff was gone too. The burnt sleeping bag, the cans, even the bones. Only some flattened grass and a few boot prints remained. Later, when the Park Service and local sheriff went through the area with dogs, they found a small campsite about half a mile deeper into the forest. It looked like someone had been living there for a while. Old food, empty fuel cans, clothes hanging on branches. There was also a pile of animal bones and a few things that didn't belong in the woods. Rusted knives, shoes, and a backpack with a torn driver's license from a missing man reported 2 years earlier. The case never led anywhere. They never caught anyone, and no one claimed responsibility. The official report called it evidence of long-term illegal habitation. But to me it felt more deliberate than that. Someone had been out there watching, waiting, living off the land in the middle of a park that was supposed to be empty. I transferred to another district the next season. Even now, whenever I camp alone, I can't shake the habit of checking for footprints around my tent in the morning, or listening for movement after dark. The forest can hide anything if you give it enough time, and I've learned that not everything you find out there wants to be found. I was working as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana during the summer of 2018. The park wasn't one of the famous ones people drove across the country to visit, but it was big enough to get lost in and remote enough that we rarely saw anyone outside of hunting season. Most of my duties were simple: checking trail markers, maintaining campgrounds, clearing fallen branches from service roads, keeping an eye on wildlife. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. At least it was supposed to be. Around mid-August, the days were still warm, but the nights started getting colder. The kind of chill that made the pine trees creak after sunset. That week, I was assigned to patrol an area called Ridge 47, a high section of forest where the terrain dropped sharply into a canyon. It was one of the less traveled areas, and people mostly stayed away because the dirt road up there was rough, and the cell signal was almost non-existent. My supervisor wanted me to check an old fire lookout tower that had been reported as damaged after a storm. I packed light, a flashlight, radio, first aid kit, and enough food and water for 2 days. I drove up the mountain road in the ranger truck until the trees got so thick that the sunlight barely touched the ground. The drive itself was long and slow, full of switchbacks and steep grades. The air smelled like wet bark and mud. The further I went, the quieter it got. Even the birds seemed to stay away from that place. The tower was about a mile's hike from where the road ended, so I parked, locked the truck, and started on foot. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the kind of path that looked like no one had used it in years. My boots sank into damp moss as I climbed. After about 40 minutes, I reached the lookout. It stood on a steel frame about 30 feet tall with rust climbing up the legs. The small cabin at the top had shattered windows, and one of the support beams had twisted slightly, probably from a lightning strike or strong wind. I climbed the stairs slowly, testing each step before trusting my weight on it. The top floor smelled like mold and damp wood. A half-broken chair and an old notebook sat on the table inside. The roof leaked in 3 spots. I took a few photos for the maintenance report and made notes about the damage. It was routine, but something about the place made my stomach tighten. It wasn't fear exactly, it was that quiet, heavy silence that you only feel when you're being watched. As I stood by the window looking out over the valley, I noticed something odd below. A small clearing with a dark patch near the center. It looked burned like a campfire that had gone out, but the shape wasn't round. It was longer, almost rectangular. I figured maybe someone had built a fire pit out of rocks. I decided to check it out before heading back. The trail down to the clearing was steeper than it looked from above. The soil was soft and I slid a few times, catching myself on tree roots. The air was cooler down there, and I could hear a faint trickle of water somewhere nearby. When I reached the clearing, I realized that what I thought was a fire pit wasn't that at all. It was a deep hole, maybe 6 or 7 feet long and about 3 feet wide. The dirt piled next to it was fresh, dark, and damp. There were no tools around, no signs of camping, just that hole like someone had started digging a grave and stopped halfway through. I crouched down to look closer. The edges were clean and straight, not like something animals would make. I noticed faint marks in the dirt, heel prints, small ones, maybe from boots. There were also a few broken twigs nearby, like someone had been working there recently. The strangest part was that it didn't look abandoned. The soil at the bottom was moist, as if it had been dug that very morning. My first thought was that it might have been an illegal grave. Poachers, maybe, or someone trying to hide something. I radioed in to the base to report what I found, but the signal was weak. Static filled the speaker. I tried twice more and got nothing. I decided to mark the location with my GPS and head back to the truck where the signal was stronger. As I started back, I heard something behind me. Soft, like footsteps in wet grass. I turned around fast, but there was nothing there. The forest looked normal, still and empty. I kept walking, faster this time, scanning the trees as I went. A few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a deer or coyote, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me. When I finally reached the truck, it was almost dark. I tried the radio again and finally got through, though the connection kept cutting out. I reported the hole and said I'd return in the morning with backup. They told me to stay put for the night since driving the road in the dark was risky. That wasn't unusual, so I agreed. I parked the truck just off the trail and set up my sleeping bag in the back seat. It was a quiet night at first. The temperature dropped fast, and the forest outside went completely still. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of crunching gravel. My eyes adjusted to the dark and I looked out the window. I couldn't see anything at first, just the outline of trees against the night sky. Then I caught movement, a shadow between the trees, tall and slow, moving around the truck. I froze. I could hear my own heartbeat. The footsteps circled once, then stopped behind the vehicle. I stayed completely still, breathing through my nose, trying not to make a sound. After a long silence, the footsteps started again, heading away toward the trail. I waited several minutes before I dared to move. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up with the flashlight in my hand until the first light came through the windshield. In the morning, I stepped out carefully, checking the ground around the truck. The dirt showed clear footprints, boot prints, not animal tracks. They led from the trail to the truck and back toward the direction of that hole in the clearing. I followed them for a short distance before stopping. The prints were recent. Whoever it was had been there during the night. When backup arrived later that morning, we went back to the clearing together. The hole was filled in, completely. The pile of dirt that had been beside it was gone, leveled flat, and the ground looked freshly tamped down. No tools, no sign of who did it. It was as if the hole had never been there at all. We filed a report, marked the area for further investigation, and the site was later examined by law enforcement. They dug again but didn't find anything except compact soil and some old roots. No bones, no trash. Nothing to explain why someone had dug there or why they returned to fill it up during the night. I finished my contract that fall and didn't go back to that part of the park again. Every ranger has one memory that stays with them, and that was mine. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't see. The quiet steps in the dark, the hole that disappeared, and the simple truth that someone else had been up there, doing something they didn't want anyone to find. To this day, whenever I drive past that section of the forest, I still think about that night. The sound of footsteps outside my truck, the feeling of being watched, and that silent hole in the earth that someone made sure to cover up before dawn. I worked as a seasonal ranger in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado for 3 summers. Most of my shifts were quiet. Patrols, campsite checks, wildlife logs, and the usual late-night calls from lost hikers. But there was one shift that still sits heavy in my chest every time I think about it. It happened in late September, my last month before winter closure, when the park emptied out and the forest felt larger than it did in summer. The tourists were gone, the trails were quiet, and the air smelled of pine needles and cold dirt. Nights came earlier, and by 7 p.m. the ridges turned dark blue and silent except for the wind moving through the branches. That day had started normal. I'd done a morning check on the East Mesa trailhead, logged a few elk sightings, and cleaned up some trash near a campsite by the creek. Around 4 p.m., dispatch radioed in a report from a hunter who said he'd seen a vehicle parked on a back logging road that wasn't supposed to be open. It was a green Ford pickup with no plates. He said it looked abandoned but had muddy footprints leading from it into the woods. I was assigned to check it out since I was already nearby. The road wasn't on any public map anymore. It had been closed years ago due to erosion and rockfall, but I knew it. I'd driven it once before with maintenance when we installed new gates. It ran through a dense stretch of forest where the pines grew tight together, and sunlight barely reached the ground. The dirt was soft from rain earlier that week, so when I drove up in my Ranger truck, the tires made deep tracks. About a mile down the road, I saw the green pickup. The paint was dull and scratched, and the windows were streaked with mud. No plates, just like the hunter said. The hood was cold when I touched it, so it hadn't been there recently. The passenger door was locked, but the driver's side was slightly open. Inside were a few empty water bottles, a torn map, and a single work glove on the seat. I wrote down the VIN, took photos for the report, and looked around for footprints. There were prints, boot treads, medium size, leading off the road and down a steep incline toward the creek valley. They weren't fresh but hadn't been washed away either, probably a day or 2 old. My plan was simple. Follow them for a short distance, see if I could locate the person or signs of camping, then report back before dark. The forest down there was thick. The slope was steep enough that I had to grab branches to steady myself. I kept marking my trail with orange tape every 50 feet. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and I could hear water somewhere below. After about 15 minutes, the footprints faded into a mix of moss and pine needles. I crouched down, checked for any broken twigs or disturbed soil, and noticed something odd. A section of ground near a fallen log looked recently dug. The dirt was darker, clumped, and didn't match the untouched soil nearby. At first, I thought it was a small animal den or someone burying trash. But the shape was rectangular, about 5 feet long, 2 feet wide, and maybe 2 feet deep. The edges were rough, but clearly dug by hand. My chest tightened. I knelt down and poked a stick into the soil. It sank easily. I moved some dirt aside and saw what looked like a black plastic tarp. That was when my stomach dropped. I didn't uncover more. Protocol said to stop if there's any sign of a burial or crime evidence. I marked the spot with tape and flagged my GPS coordinates. The sun was already dropping low, and the shadows under the trees were getting long and gray. I started heading back toward my trail markers, but as I climbed up, something felt off. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no wind, just the faint crunch of my boots. Halfway up, I saw movement behind me. It was quick, low to the ground, maybe 20 yards back. I turned and saw nothing but trees. I stood still, trying to listen, but the quiet was complete. I decided not to linger. I kept walking, faster this time. When I reached the last marker, I realized it wasn't there anymore. The orange tape I'd tied was gone. I checked nearby trunks thinking I'd misremembered, but none had tape. I don't panic easily, but that moment got to me. The woods all looked the same, and daylight was fading fast. I kept my direction steady uphill using my compass. It should have taken 10 minutes to reach the road again, but after 20 I still couldn't see it. Every tree started looking familiar, and I had the sickening feeling that I'd somehow circled. Then I heard a sound, a single crack like a branch snapping somewhere close. I turned again, but there was nothing. The silence after the sound was worse than the sound itself. I decided to make a straight line toward higher ground, where I might spot the truck or the road. The forest floor was covered in needles and damp leaves, soft enough to erase most tracks. My flashlight beam shook as I climbed, hitting trunks and brush. That's when I caught a glimpse of something between the trees, something white. I aimed the light and saw fabric, maybe cloth, tangled on a branch. When I got closer, it wasn't just cloth, it was a piece of a torn shirt sleeve with what looked like dried blood on the edge. That was enough. I stopped, radioed dispatch, and gave my coordinates. The signal was weak, but I managed to send a partial message. Possible burial site, unknown activity, request backup. Static filled the rest. I shut the radio off and just stood there for a while, trying to control my breathing. I stayed still, flashlight off, listening. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard the faint sound of an engine somewhere far up the hill. Relief hit me so hard I almost shouted. I started moving toward it, keeping my light low. When I finally reached the road, it was fully dark. My truck sat where I'd left it, headlights catching mist in the air. But something was different. The passenger door was open. I knew I'd locked it before heading down. Inside, my gear bag was unzipped, and the tape roll I'd been using was gone. I didn't wait around. I got in, started the truck, and drove out fast. The whole drive back, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting headlights behind me. But there was nothing. I filed the report that night, and a full investigation team went out the next morning. They found the burial site exactly where I marked it. Inside the tarp was a human body, male, mid-30s, badly decomposed. Nearby, they found a shovel and a second pair of boots that didn't match the prints I'd followed. The green pickup was towed out and later confirmed stolen from New Mexico. Whoever had been using it had vanished without a trace. The rangers and sheriff's deputies combed that whole section of forest for days. They found signs that someone had been camping out there, scraps of food packaging and a few cigarette butts, but no suspect. I transferred out of that park after the season ended. The investigators never caught whoever was out there, and no one ever came forward about the body. I still remember that feeling in the woods, the quiet, the missing tape, the open truck door. People think working in the wilderness is peaceful, but after that, I learned something important. The forest doesn't need monsters or ghosts to scare you. Sometimes the scariest thing out there is another person who knows those woods just a little better than you do. I was stationed as a park ranger in the northern section of Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. The section I patrolled was one of the more remote parts of the forest, filled with deep ravines, miles of dense pine, and narrow dirt roads that could take hours to drive through. My duty was simple: check on the campsites, monitor wildlife activity, keep the trails safe, and report anything unusual. It was a quiet life, and most of the time, the silence was what I liked most about it. But that silence could also turn heavy, especially when the sun went down and all you could hear were the faint sounds of the forest breathing. It was early October when this happened. The weather was starting to cool down, and the park was almost empty since most visitors were gone for the season. I was on a 5-day patrol through a section known as Black Hollow, a stretch of forest about 20 miles long and rarely visited by campers. The area was thick with old-growth pines, tangled underbrush, and winding animal trails that crossed over each other so often that a person unfamiliar with the place could easily get lost. The terrain was steep, and my assigned cabin, a small single-room wooden structure built decades ago, was perched near a narrow river that ran through the hollow. It had no electricity, No phone service, and was miles from the nearest ranger station. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked the trails, noted signs of elk movement, cleaned up an old fire pit someone had left behind, and made sure the stream behind the cabin wasn't blocked by fallen branches. At night, I sat on the steps of the cabin with my flashlight off, just listening. There's something about being surrounded by miles of forest that makes every sound sharper. The crack of a branch, the rustle of something moving in the brush, the faint hum of wind moving through the trees. All of it blends into a strange rhythm that can make your mind play tricks on you if you let it. On the third night, the wind had died down completely. The air was still and the forest felt heavier than usual. Around midnight, I was writing notes in my logbook when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint dragging sound like something being pulled through the dirt. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound kept stopping and starting in uneven intervals. I stood up, turned off the lantern, and went to the window. I could barely see anything outside except the faint outline of the trees under the moonlight. I waited a while, but the sound faded away. In the morning, I went out to check the area. About 20 yards from the cabin, I found a long mark in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged through it. It stretched from the tree line toward the riverbank. There were no footprints, no animal tracks, just a deep line pressed into the earth. I followed it down to the water, but it disappeared into the mud at the edge. I thought maybe a bear had dragged a carcass or a large branch had fallen and been pulled by the current, so I didn't think too much about it. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach that morning. Later that day, I hiked up the ridge to check a few wildlife cameras we'd set up weeks earlier. Most of them just showed elk, foxes, and raccoons, but one camera, the one facing a narrow clearing about a mile north of the cabin, had its lens cracked and tilted down. I removed the memory card and replaced the camera. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I checked the footage on my laptop. The first few videos were normal, deer moving at night, a raccoon sniffing near the lens, but then the last recording caught my attention. The footage was from around 3 a.m., 2 nights before. The trees were still, no wind, no animals. Then, out of nowhere, the camera shook slightly like something had brushed past it. A few seconds later, it tilted downward and all that could be seen was dirt and leaves. The audio picked up a faint sound, almost like breathing, but not close. More like it was coming from deeper in the trees. It sent a cold chill through me. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that dragging sound, about the mark in the dirt, about the broken camera. Around 2 a.m. I heard movement again, soft, uneven steps circling the cabin. I stayed still, my flashlight off, listening. The sound stopped right outside the door. I could hear the wood creak just slightly. I grabbed my rifle and waited, every nerve tight. After what felt like minutes, the sound faded away into the woods. I didn't go outside until sunrise. When daylight came, I found more marks near the cabin, faint impressions. Not full footprints, but something irregular, almost as if someone had been walking barefoot in the mud. They led into the trees behind the cabin. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail twisted through the forest for about half a mile before ending near a large fallen pine. Behind it was a small pit, shallow, maybe 2 feet deep. Inside it was a torn piece of blue fabric and part of a backpack strap. I recognized that strap immediately. 3 weeks earlier, a hiker had gone missing in this section of the park. His car was found at a trailhead about 8 miles south, but search teams hadn't found any trace of him. I had been part of that search. Now I was staring at what looked like part of his gear. I marked the spot with tape and reported it once I got a signal later that day on my radio. They told me a team would hike in the next morning to investigate. That night was the longest of my life. I barely moved from my chair, my rifle within reach, the lantern burning low. The forest was dead quiet again. No insects, no wind, just a heavy stillness pressing against the cabin walls. Around midnight, I heard the dragging sound again, faint at first, then louder. It was close, moving along the back wall. I didn't move. The sound stopped. Then there was a soft thud against the cabin, like something hitting the side. I froze. After a few seconds, another thud. Then silence. I waited for hours until the sky started to lighten. When the search team arrived the next morning, I showed them the pit and the marks. They widened the search area and found more torn fabric, bits of rope, and what looked like an old tarp deeper in the trees. About 50 yards from there, they found bones scattered near a dried creek bed. They were human. The coroner later confirmed they belonged to the missing hiker. The official report said he'd likely gotten lost, injured himself, and died from exposure. But I'd been in that forest long enough to know how strange those marks had been. How something or someone had been dragging things through the dirt near my cabin. They said animals might have moved the body afterward, which could explain the marks. I tried to believe that. I really did. But the following week, when I returned to the same cabin for another patrol, I noticed a new mark in the dirt near the river. The same deep line, fresh, cutting through the mud and disappearing into the trees. There hadn't been any animals large enough to make it in that area recently. I stood there for a long time, staring at that mark, listening to the stillness pressing in around me. Eventually, I turned back toward the cabin, but that feeling in my stomach returned. The same cold, heavy weight. It wasn't fear exactly, but something deeper, like the forest was watching me and waiting. That night, I locked the cabin door, kept the lantern burning, and didn't close my eyes once. I transferred to another district a few months later. I never went back to Black Hollow again, but sometimes when the wind dies down and the woods go silent, I can still hear that faint dragging sound in my head, the one that started everything. I started working as a park ranger in central Idaho in the summer of 2015. The job wasn't anything glamorous, but I liked being outdoors and away from crowds. My post covered a wide stretch of forest that connected to the Salmon Chalice National Forest. It was quiet most of the time. Long dirt roads, miles of pine trees, and only the occasional hunter, hiker, or camper passing through. I was stationed at a small outpost that had one cabin, a radio tower, and a storage shed. The nearest ranger station was about 40 miles away. Most nights it was just me, a small fire, and the sound of wind moving through the trees. One late August evening, I was assigned to check the north boundary area near an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. There had been reports of someone camping without a permit, leaving trash around, maybe even poaching elk. I packed my gear, filled the gas tank, and started the drive up around 5 p.m. The road was narrow and uneven, covered in loose gravel and mud from rain earlier in the week. The trees were dense and the sun barely reached through, so even though it was late afternoon, it already felt like dusk. About 10 miles in, I stopped near an open clearing where the old road split. There was a faint smell of smoke, not strong, but enough to tell me someone had made a fire nearby recently. I parked the truck, grabbed my flashlight, and followed the scent through the woods. The ground was soft, and my boots sank slightly into the moss with every step. I noticed crushed beer cans, boot prints, and a few cigarette butts scattered around. A few hundred feet deeper, I found a small campsite, half-collapsed tent, burnt-out fire ring, and a cooler tipped on its side. It looked like whoever had been there left in a hurry. The tent still had a sleeping bag inside, some clothes, and a small hunting knife stuck into a log. It wasn't unusual to find abandoned camps, but something about this one made me uneasy. There were no animal tracks, no signs of struggle, just a strange sense that the person had walked off and never come back. I made a note in my log and decided to search a bit further before heading back. I followed what looked like a faint trail going downhill, probably made by the same person. It led through thick brush toward a dry creek bed. Down there, I found a tarp tangled in some branches and a set of fresh boot prints heading east. The prints looked fairly recent, maybe a day or two old. I followed them for about half a mile before realizing it was getting dark faster than I expected. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no birds, not even the wind. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel watched. I turned back toward my truck but ended up a bit disoriented. I knew the general direction, but the trees all looked the same, and the ground seemed to shift subtly under the fading light. I tried to calm myself, moving slowly and checking my compass every few steps. When I finally saw the faint glint of my truck's windshield through the trees, I felt relief, until I noticed something odd. There was a second set of footprints near my truck, not mine. They circled the vehicle once, then trailed off into the trees. The prints looked similar to the ones I had been following. Same size, same boot type. Whoever it was had come by while I was gone. My doors were still locked, nothing taken, but it gave me a bad feeling. I sat in the truck for a few minutes, scanning the woods, then decided to drive back to the cabin before it got completely dark. The road back was rough, and the headlights cut through the mist starting to form in the valleys. About halfway down, I caught something in the beam, a figure standing near a tree on the side of the road. I hit the brakes, but by the time I looked closer, the figure was gone. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light or a branch moving in the fog, but I couldn't shake the image of someone standing there. I kept driving, slower this time, constantly checking the mirrors. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and did my usual evening check of the perimeter. The night was cold, and the smell of pine was heavy in the air. Around 11 p.m., I heard a sound outside, faint footsteps on gravel. I turned off the lantern inside and looked through the window. The darkness outside was complete. Even the stars were hidden behind clouds. I couldn't see anything, but the footsteps stopped right outside the cabin. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard it, the soft click of something metal against wood, maybe a knife or a gun barrel brushing the wall. I stayed still for what felt like an hour. Eventually the noise faded and I didn't hear anything else. When the first light came up around 6 a.m., I stepped outside. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt, leading from the tree line straight up to the cabin and back again. The same pattern I had seen near the truck. I followed them for about 50 yards before they disappeared into the brush. No sign of a camp, no tire tracks, nothing. It was like whoever it was had melted back into the forest. I reported it to the main station later that morning. They sent another ranger out and we searched the area for most of the day. We didn't find anyone, but we did come across something strange near the dry creek. A small pile of bones cleaned and stacked neatly, like someone had been collecting them. Not animal bones either. They looked human. Old, but not ancient. We flagged the site for investigation, and a few weeks later, the results came back confirming they belonged to at least 2 different people. The authorities suspected they were hikers who went missing years earlier. The area was remote enough that no one would have stumbled on it by accident. I still think about those footprints sometimes, how they circled my truck, how they came right up to my cabin door that night. Maybe it was the same person who left that camp behind. Maybe someone living off the grid, maybe something else entirely. After that incident, I asked to be transferred to another post. I couldn't sleep right for months. Every creak, every gust of wind against the window made me think someone was standing outside again. To this day, whenever I drive through that part of Idaho and see those endless pines, I think about the quiet night I spent alone out there, and how easily someone could disappear in those woods, without a sound, without a trace, just like the ones whose bones we found in the dirt. I worked as a park ranger in a remote area of northern Montana for about 6 years. The park covered over 200,000 acres of mountains, rivers, and forests, most of it unreachable except by old logging roads or days of hiking. My main job was to patrol trails, check fire restrictions, and keep an eye out for poachers or lost hikers. Most days were quiet, long stretches of silence broken only by wind in the pines or the distant rumble of a river. But there was one summer that still sits in my head, heavy and clear, and I know I'll never forget what happened out there. It was late July, right at the height of tourist season, and we'd been dealing with unusually dry weather. Fires had been popping up all across the region. My supervisor sent me to a section called Miller Ridge to monitor a small fire that had burned itself out the week before. It was a remote place, about 30 miles from the nearest ranger station, and only accessible by a narrow dirt road that twisted up the ridge. There were no cabins, no campsites, nothing but a few game trails and old logging clearings. I loaded my truck with supplies for 3 days and set out before sunrise. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was already high, and the heat felt heavy even at that elevation. I parked near a small turnout and hiked to the old burn area, checking for smoke, hot spots, or fallen trees that might block the trail. The air smelled like ash and dry pine needles. Everything was quiet, unnaturally so. Usually you hear birds, maybe chipmunks scurrying, but that morning there was nothing. just a constant dry wind pushing through blackened trees. I made camp near a small creek at the bottom of the ridge. There was still enough shade from a few unburned pines to set up my tent and cooking gear. I logged my report, ate a simple dinner, and went to sleep early. Around midnight, I woke up to my dog Tucker, growling low near the tent flap. He wasn't barking, just that low rumble he'd make when something was close. I turned on my flashlight and listened. There were footsteps somewhere out there, moving slowly along the creek bed. I assumed it was an elk or maybe a black bear, so I stayed still, waiting for it to pass. After a few minutes, the sound faded and Tucker calmed down. I fell back asleep, thinking nothing more of it. The next morning, I found large boot prints in the soft dirt near the creek, only a few yards from my tent. They weren't mine. They looked fresh, maybe from the night before. No vehicle tracks nearby, no camping gear, just those footprints heading down the creek toward the east. That was odd because this part of the park wasn't open to the public. Only rangers were authorized this deep in. I followed the prints for a short distance before they disappeared in the gravel along the water. I noted it in my report and kept on with my inspection, but the thought of someone wandering that deep into the backcountry without clearance stuck in my head. That evening, as the sun started to set, I was writing notes near the campfire when I heard movement again. This time it wasn't just one set of footsteps. It sounded like several, faint but steady, coming from the direction of the burned ridge. Tucker stood up, ears back, tail stiff, staring into the dark. I shined my light and saw nothing, but the sound stopped the moment I did. I called out, not words, just a sharp noise. Men waited. No answer. I sat there for a long time, light off, listening to the forest breathe around me. Eventually, I convinced myself it was deer or maybe wind-shifting branches. But Tucker didn't relax until well past midnight. The next morning, I hiked farther up the ridge to check on a lookout post we hadn't used in years. It was an old wooden platform nailed into the side of a rocky outcrop, used back in the 60s for fire spotting. I wanted a better view of the valley and to see if maybe I could spot any smoke or trespassers. When I reached it, I noticed something immediately. The old boards were covered with empty food cans, cigarette butts, and torn plastic wrappers. Someone had been staying there recently. The smell of stale smoke hung in the air. It looked like a rough camp, the kind made by someone hiding out, not a hiker passing through. I climbed up and found a torn backpack tucked under a beam. Inside were a few canned goods, a lighter, and a small knife. No ID, no phone, nothing else. The food was still fresh enough that whoever had been there must have left only a day or two ago. I radioed it in, but the signal was weak, barely reaching the next ranger outpost. They said they'd send someone to check on me the next morning. That meant I had to spend another night up there alone. That evening felt heavier than the others. The air was still and thick, no wind at all. The forest around me felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't make a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food and sat inside my tent with Tucker, listening to every sound outside. Around 2 a.m. I heard something again. This time it was close. Twigs snapping, slow steps circling my camp. Tucker began to growl deep in his chest, but I kept him quiet, holding his collar tight. I could hear breathing, faint but human, just beyond the edge of my tent. I froze completely, my heart thudding so loud I was sure it could be heard. After several long seconds, the footsteps moved away, fading back toward the creek. I waited until dawn before stepping outside. When I did, I found a few more boot prints near the tent, fresh ones pressed deep into the dirt. Whoever it was had walked right around my camp, no more than 5 feet from where I was sleeping. When backup finally arrived late that morning, we followed the prints for several miles down the creek. Eventually, they led us to a small clearing hidden between thick trees. There we found an old blue tarp strung up between branches, a sleeping bag, and a pile of trash. It looked like someone had been living out there for weeks, maybe months. There were animal bones scattered around, cleaned and broken apart, and a few burned metal cans that still smelled faintly of food. But the strangest thing was that it looked abandoned in a hurry. Clothes half buried in leaves, a cooking pot still on a cold fire. We searched the surrounding area for hours but found nothing else. No person, no vehicle, no sign of where they'd gone. It was as if whoever was out there had just vanished sometime during the night. The report filed later described it as an unauthorized transient encampment. They sent more rangers out to sweep the ridge, and after a week, everything was cleared. I was reassigned to another district for the rest of the season, but I never forgot those nights. What still bothers me most isn't the footprints or the trash or the fact that someone had been so close without me knowing. It's that whoever it was knew I was there. They walked around my camp twice and never tried to steal anything or attack. They just watched, listened, waited in the dark. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about how quiet the forest was that week. No birds, no insects, just the sound of slow, careful footsteps somewhere beyond the edge of the firelight. And I know that even out there, miles from anyone, I was never really alone. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 9 years, and I've seen plenty of strange things out here in northern Montana. People doing dumb stuff, animals acting oddly, weather turning in minutes. But nothing has ever unsettled me the way that one summer search did. It started in late July, when the days stretched long but the forest never really went quiet. I was stationed at a remote ranger outpost near the edge of Glacier National Park, where the tree line gives way to steep ridges and narrow creeks that twist through thick pine. The air always smelled of sap and dirt, and even when the wind stopped, you could still hear the trees shifting and cracking somewhere far off. That week had been hot and still, the kind of weather that makes the forest feel heavier. We'd had a few hikers go missing before, but usually they turned up after getting turned around on the trails. This time, it was a man in his late 30s who hadn't come back to his campsite near McDonald Creek. His car was still parked at the trailhead, tent still up, food untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no bear prints, no blood, nothing, just gone. I was one of the rangers sent to look for him. I remember leaving the outpost just after dawn, when the ground was still wet with dew and the mosquitoes hovered in clouds above the ferns. I carried my pack, GPS, and a small radio, and followed the creek upstream, scanning for any sign of footprints. The sound of the water was steady, echoing between the trees, and after an hour I stopped noticing it. Every so often I'd call the man's name into the woods, wait, and then keep moving. Around noon I found a boot print. It was sunk deep in the mud, fresh enough that the edges hadn't started to fill back in. 100 feet away there was another one, then nothing. I followed that faint direction, moving uphill into rougher terrain. The brush was thicker there, chest high and clawing at my clothes, and the ground sloped sharply. I could hear something big moving somewhere above me, breaking branches. I figured it might have been an elk or maybe a moose, but the movement stopped whenever I did. After another mile, I came to an old service road that had long since grown over. The GPS map showed it hadn't been used in decades. I followed it east, thinking maybe the guy had wandered onto it looking for an easier path back down. I could smell something faint in the air then, like burnt rubber mixed with damp soil. I thought maybe lightning had hit a tree somewhere, so I kept walking. A few hundred yards ahead, I found the source of the smell. There was an old camper trailer sitting half-collapsed under the trees, the metal sides caved in and the roof covered in moss. It must have been sitting there since the 70s, hidden off the road where no one would notice it. The smell was strongest around it. The door had rotted away, and inside everything was blackened as if it had burned once. I didn't go in at first. I just stood there listening. The woods had gone dead quiet. No insects, no wind, just the faint ticking sound of something cooling down, though I couldn't tell what. I finally stepped up to the doorway, shining my flashlight inside. There were 2 chairs, both half melted into the floor, a broken table, and what looked like the remains of a small stove. On the back wall, I noticed something odd. Dozens of scratches carved into the paneling, deep enough to gouge through the thin wood. They weren't letters or numbers, just straight vertical lines and clusters like someone marking days. The smell made me feel sick, so I backed out and circled around the back of the camper. That's when I saw the ground. It had been dug up recently. Not a big hole, maybe 2 or 3 feet wide, and the dirt was still soft. There was a pile of small bones next to it, maybe from a deer or some other animal. I didn't like the look of it, so I marked the spot on my GPS and radioed in what I found. There was no reply. I checked my radio battery. It was full. I decided to head back toward the main trail to get a signal, but the forest looked different on the way down. I couldn't find the same service road again. Everything looked overgrown and uneven, and the slope kept pulling me in the wrong direction. The sun was starting to dip, the light turning orange through the trees, and I realized how deep in I really was. The silence started to weigh on me again. Every few minutes, I'd think I heard something walking parallel to me. Slow, steady, like someone pacing me just out of sight. I finally reached a clearing where the ground leveled out near a bend in the creek. I stopped to fill my water bottle, and that's when I noticed a torn piece of fabric caught in a branch on the opposite bank. It was dark red and looked like a sleeve from a flannel shirt. I crossed over and found a faint path, just wide enough for one person to move through. The ground was littered with old cans, wrappers, and bits of plastic. It looked like someone had been staying there for a long time. There was a makeshift shelter about 50 feet back, built out of branches, tarps, and part of a tent. Inside were empty food cans, a metal pot, and a bunch of torn maps of the park. Most of them were marked with circles drawn in pen, places along creeks and ridges, all far from the main trails. One circle was drawn around the exact area where the man had gone missing. Another was around where I was standing. It was nearly dark by then, and I felt an awful kind of pressure in my chest, like I shouldn't be there. I started back toward the creek, but I heard a twig snap from inside the trees behind the shelter. I froze waiting, but there was nothing. I didn't look back. I just started walking fast, then jogging, keeping my flashlight pointed at the ground. I didn't stop until I hit the creek again and followed it all the way down until I finally picked up a faint radio signal. When I got back to the outpost hours later, another team had gone out and found the missing man, about 3 miles from where I'd been. He'd fallen down a ravine and broken his leg. He was dehydrated and shaken but alive. When I asked where he'd been before that, he said he'd seen lights deep in the forest at night, like flashlights moving around, and followed them thinking it was a search party. But no one had been searching that far in yet. A week later, I went back with a small team to check the burned-out camper. It was gone. Not just collapsed, gone. There was only a patch of flat earth where it had been, and no tire tracks or drag marks leading away. The dug-up hole was filled back in, and the bones were gone too. We never found out who had been staying in that part of the forest or why those maps had all those marked spots. After that, I stopped volunteering for solo searches. I still work as a ranger, but I stay closer to the main trails now. Sometimes when I'm out doing maintenance, I still catch that faint burnt smell again, same as that day. And every time I do, the forest around me goes quiet. I don't stay to find out where it's coming from anymore. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in northern Wyoming, in a place called Bighorn National Forest. It's a vast stretch of wilderness, miles of spruce trees, thick undergrowth, and winding dirt roads that seem to disappear into nowhere. My job was simple on paper: maintain trails, check campsites, and make sure visitors followed the rules. But what no one tells you is how empty the forest feels after dark. There are no lights, no sounds of traffic, just wind, branches moving, and the steady noise of your own breathing. After a few nights alone out there, even the silence starts to feel like it's watching you. It was late September, near the end of my shift for the year. The nights had turned cold, and the air smelled of pine and old smoke from leftover campfires. Most tourists were gone except for a few hunters scattered deep in the forest. My duty that week was to check the remote backcountry campsites before winter closure. There were about a dozen of them spread across the northern ridge, and the farthest one, Campsite 19, was the most isolated. It sat near an old service road that hadn't been maintained for years. Most rangers avoided that route because it was rough and overgrown, but I was used to it. I packed my truck with fuel, food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and my radio. The plan was to check the site, stay overnight, and drive back in the morning. By the time I left the station, the sun was already low. The drive took me almost 2 hours, crawling over ruts and fallen branches. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The trees grew closer together, blocking the last bit of sunlight, and the road started to narrow until it was just 2 lines of dirt with grass in between. I finally reached the old sign for Campsite 19, half-buried, letters faded, and parked by the clearing. It was about 7 in the evening, the air already freezing cold. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and started my inspection. The site looked unused. The fire ring was filled with ash, and there were broken beer bottles scattered near the logs. I walked around, noting down what needed cleaning. The forest was dead quiet except for the creaking of trees. I remember hearing a soft metallic sound behind me, like a piece of wire or chain moving. I turned and saw nothing, just the dark green of the woods and my truck about 20 yards away. I shrugged it off and finished up. When night came, I sat by a small fire I built near the truck. I had my dinner, canned stew, and checked in on the radio, but the signal was weak out here. After that, I sat in silence, watching the flames rise and fall. The firelight barely reached the tree line, and beyond that it was total darkness. I could hear the faint rustling of animals in the brush. Nothing unusual. But around 10 p.m. something changed. The sound of movement became heavier. Not the quick steps of deer or the scratching of raccoons, but slow, dragging footsteps. It came from behind the trees, moving in a circle around my camp. I shined my flashlight, expecting to catch a bear or elk, but there was nothing. Just the sound of something large walking through the leaves, stopping when I pointed the light, then starting again when I turned it away. I told myself it was probably a moose or something big that wasn't afraid of me, but after a few minutes the noise stopped completely. The forest went still. I waited a long time, then put out the fire and got into my truck. I locked the doors, rolled up the windows, and lay in the back seat with my sleeping bag pulled to my chest. The truck was cold and I could hear my heartbeat. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of metal tapping. It was faint but steady. Tap, 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 against the side of my truck. My flashlight was on the seat beside me, and when I picked it up, the noise stopped. I sat completely still, my hand gripping the light, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. I thought about stepping out, but something told me not to. Instead, I stayed awake until dawn, barely moving. When daylight came, I got out to check. The ground was wet with dew, and the air was cold enough that my breath showed. On the passenger side of the truck, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Deep scratches on the paint, running in uneven lines from the door handle down to the bottom of the frame. Whatever made them wasn't an animal claw. They were too straight, too controlled, as if done with a piece of metal. I looked around the clearing for any sign of movement, but it was empty. I decided to pack up immediately. I loaded my gear and started the engine. As I turned the truck around, I noticed something strange about the dirt road. Fresh tire marks, but not from my vehicle. They were smaller, like from an old pickup or ATV, and they led deeper into the forest past the campsite where there shouldn't have been any road at all. For some reason, I followed them. I told myself it was to make sure no one was trespassing, but deep down, I think I just needed to know what had been out there that night. The tracks led about half a mile down a narrow path before stopping near a dry creek bed. There was an old fire pit there, surrounded by beer cans, rope, and a torn sleeping bag. But what really caught my attention was the smell, rot and something chemical like gasoline. The ground around the pit was blackened, as if something had been burned recently. I searched the area and found an old hunting knife half buried in dirt, rusted but still sharp. It felt wrong to stay there any longer. I took photos for the report and drove back as fast as the road allowed. The whole time I had this feeling that someone was watching me from between the trees. Every time I checked my mirror, I thought I saw movement, but it was probably my nerves. When I got back to the station, I turned in the report, but I didn't mention the tapping on the truck or the scratches. I only wrote about finding an illegal campsite and possible evidence of poaching. 2 weeks later, another ranger was sent to clean the area. He came back looking pale and quiet. When I asked what happened, he just said the campsite was gone. The fire pit, the cans, everything, completely cleared. Like no one had ever been there. He also said the road beyond the ridge was blocked off with fallen trees, meaning no vehicle could have driven that way. I left that job at the end of the season. I still think about that night sometimes, about the scratches and the slow steps circling my camp. I never figured out who or what was out there, but the thing that haunts me most isn't the noise or the darkness. It's the thought that maybe out in that forest, someone else had camped there before me, someone who never made it back, and whoever was responsible had come back again, just to make sure no one found what they'd done. Even now, when I drive past a wooded area at night, I still find myself checking the mirrors, half expecting to see a figure standing between the trees, waiting for the firelight to go out. I had been working as a park ranger in northern Montana for about 4 years when I got assigned to a remote backcountry station near the base of the Swan Range. The area was dense with lodgepole pines, old trails, and long stretches of land where you could go days without seeing another person. The station was a small wooden cabin built decades ago, sitting about half a mile from a narrow dirt road. It had no electricity, just a hand pump for water and a propane heater. I used to like being out there. It was quiet, far from the noise, and I thought I could handle the isolation better than most. But that was before what happened that fall. It started around late September when the nights got colder and the mornings were misty and damp. My main job was to check trails for washouts, inspect old fire lookouts, and make sure hunters and hikers signed in at the trailheads. During that time, the forest was almost empty. Most visitors had gone home after summer, leaving only a few hunters or campers scattered miles apart. I didn't mind. I liked the peace of it. The woods had a smell that only came out in fall, wet bark, pine, and the faint scent of decaying leaves. One morning I was checking a remote campsite about 8 miles east of my cabin. The forest there was thick with steep terrain and a small stream that cut through the valley. The spot was old and rarely used. When I got there, I noticed a small fire pit still warm, but no tent, no gear, nothing else around. The ashes were gray but not cold, which meant someone had been there not long before. That wasn't unusual, but what caught my eye were the tire marks leading off the dirt road and into the brush. The tracks were deep and angled weirdly, as if someone had tried to drive off the main trail and then backed up again. It didn't make sense. The ground there was too rough for that. I made a note and kept moving, thinking maybe a hunter had parked there and left on foot. But later that afternoon, as I was heading back to the cabin, I found a blue tarp tangled in the undergrowth about 100 yards from the site. It looked ripped, like someone had tried to drag it. There were also faint scuff marks in the dirt, just irregular enough to make me think something heavy had been pulled. I didn't find anything else, no footprints clear enough to follow, no trash, no gear. I logged it as abandoned material and moved on. That night, around 9 p.m., I sat outside the cabin with my flashlight, eating from a can of chili. The forest was still, with only the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Then in the distance, faint but sharp, I heard what sounded like metal scraping. It was quick, maybe a second or two, then gone. It came again after a few minutes, closer this time, from somewhere down the trail that led toward the creek. I figured it might be an animal caught on something, or maybe someone messing around with their vehicle. I grabbed my light and followed the trail for about 50 yards, but the sound stopped. When I turned off my flashlight, everything went black. The forest at night in that area is pure darkness, so thick it feels like it closes in on you. I stayed there for a few minutes listening, but heard nothing else. The next morning I went back to check the spot. There were no tire marks, no footprints, no metal pieces, nothing. I started to wonder if it had been wind or a branch falling. Still, something about it made me uneasy. Over the next few days, little things started happening. I'd find branches placed oddly across the trail, like someone had intentionally laid them in patterns. My tools would be moved around in the shed, even though I always put them back in the same order. One morning I found a set of boot prints behind the cabin near the tree line. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and led toward the creek, but the trail ended suddenly in the soft ground. I tried to tell myself it was probably a lost hunter passing through, but it didn't sit right with me that they came that close without saying anything. About a week later, I was sent out to check a fire lookout about 12 miles from my post. It was an old tower that hadn't been used in years, just maintained occasionally for safety reasons. The road there was narrow, full of switchbacks, and the drive took me almost an hour. When I arrived, the air felt heavy like before a storm. I climbed up the metal stairs to the lookout. The door was slightly open. Inside, everything was covered in dust except for a fresh set of boot prints on the floor. They led to the corner near the window and stopped there. Nothing else was disturbed. I checked every inch of that place. No trash, no food, no bedding, no sign anyone had slept there. Just those prints, like whoever made them stood and looked out the window for a while and then left. On the way back down the tower, I noticed something nailed to one of the lower posts. A piece of blue tarp. Torn. Same color and texture as the one I had found near the old campsite. That stopped me cold for a second. I pulled it off and folded it up to bring back. It could have been coincidence, but something in my gut said otherwise. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the tracks, the tarp, the prints near the cabin. Around 2 a.m. I heard movement again. Slow, heavy steps in the brush behind the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and waited. The sound came closer, then stopped right outside the tree line. I didn't go out. I just sat there in the dark, hand tight around the light, listening to the faint sound of breathing that I couldn't tell was mine or something else's. After a long while, it stopped. When I finally went out at dawn, there were boot prints again, same size, same tread, circling the cabin this time, and one of the cabin windows had been scratched along the bottom like someone had tried to look inside. I reported it to the main ranger station that day. They sent another ranger out 2 days later to check the area with me. By then, the prints were half gone from rain, and we didn't find anything else. He figured it was just a poacher or someone camping illegally and said they'd keep an eye out. But no reports ever came in after that. A few weeks later, winter started setting in. I got reassigned to a closer station, and before I left, I did one final round through that sector. When I passed the old campsite again, I noticed the dirt had been disturbed, freshly dug in a long, uneven patch behind the fire pit. It wasn't wide enough to be a trench, just a shallow area like someone had buried something and tried to cover it quickly. I marked it but didn't have time to dig. Ground was already freezing and snow had started to fall. In spring, after the snow melted, I heard from one of the new rangers that they found a shallow grave out near that same site. A few old bones, clothing fragments, and a rusted knife handle were recovered. No ID, no clear cause of death. They assumed it had been there a while, maybe years, long before my time. But I keep thinking about that blue tarp, those prints, and the sound of something circling my cabin in the dark. Whoever had been out there that fall hadn't just been passing through. They'd been living out there, watching, moving between the trees, coming close enough to see inside my window. And whatever they buried wasn't old when I first saw that disturbed ground. It had just been covered. I still think about it when I'm out alone in the woods, and sometimes, when the wind is right and the forest goes completely still, I swear I can almost hear that same scraping sound again, metal against wood coming from somewhere deep among the trees. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana for 4 summers. Most people think it's an easy job, hiking, checking trails, helping campers, and enjoying nature. But that summer in 2019 changed the way I looked at the woods forever. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural. It was something that happens when people stop following the rules and nature slowly takes over. I was stationed at a remote section of the park, about 2 hours from the main ranger station. The area was mostly old forest, thick spruce and lodgepole pine, moss covering everything and barely any cell signal. The park had dozens of marked trails, but I was responsible for 2 long backcountry routes that almost no one used. Most rangers avoided them because they were rough, washed out, and had several miles of steep terrain where rescue would be nearly impossible. My job that summer was to inspect those trails once every 2 weeks and record anything unusual: fallen trees, erosion, animal activity, or signs of illegal camping. In early August, the supervisor told me to check the upper part of Trail 19, which led up to an old fire lookout that had been abandoned since the 80s. Hikers still went there sometimes, even though it wasn't officially open to the public. The last time anyone had gone up there, according to the records, was about 6 months earlier. I packed light, just my food, a first aid kit, my map, a GPS, and my tent, because I'd be spending one night at the midpoint clearing. I also carried my camera to record any evidence of damage or campsites. The first half of the hike went smoothly. The forest was quiet, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the crunch of pine needles under my boots. Around midday, I crossed an old wooden bridge over a narrow creek that had almost rotted through. From there, the trail started to climb steeply. The higher I went, the more overgrown it became. Branches scraped my arms, and parts of the trail were almost invisible under thick moss. By evening, I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was a small open patch surrounded by trees, with a flat spot that had clearly been used before. I found an old fire ring made of stones, some rusted cans, and a broken camp chair half buried in the dirt. I took pictures for the report, then set up my tent nearby. After eating a quick meal, I sat by the fire until the sun went down. The forest was silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. It always bothered me when the woods got that quiet. It usually meant something big was around. I assumed maybe there was a bear in the area, so I made sure all my food was sealed and stored a good distance away from the tent. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like something dragging across the ground. I stayed still, listening. It came again, slow and steady, maybe 20 yards from the tent. I reached for my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent flap. The forest outside was pitch black except for the dim orange glow of the dying fire. I didn't see anything moving. The dragging stopped for a few seconds, then started again, this time closer. I aimed the flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of something low to the ground moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, at least not the way it moved. It looked more like someone crawling. My first thought was that it might be a wounded hiker or a poacher trying to avoid being seen. I shouted a warning and shined the light around, but there was no response. When I stepped out of the tent, the woods went dead silent again. I stood there for a long time, scanning every shadow until the battery on my flashlight started to dim. Nothing. I went back into the tent, zipped it up, and barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I found tracks, not footprints exactly, but drag marks through the moss leading downhill toward the creek. I followed them for maybe half a mile before they disappeared into thick brush. I made a note of it, thinking maybe it was an injured animal, and kept going toward the lookout. By midday, I reached the ridge where the old lookout stood. The place was falling apart. The stairs half collapsed, roof caved in. Inside, there were old supplies, a rusted lantern, a cot with torn fabric, and a few empty cans. But what caught my eye was a newer-looking backpack in the corner. It was a blue hiking pack with a broken zipper, covered in dust but not old enough to belong to whoever abandoned the lookout decades ago. Inside were a few personal items, a water bottle, a knife, and a folded map with a name written on it. The map was marked with circles around the same clearing where I had camped and a few notes scribbled in pencil. One line said, "Heard it again. Keeps crawling near the creek." My stomach dropped. I realized someone else had camped there not long ago and probably heard the same sounds I did. I searched the area for any signs of a recent camp but didn't find anything else. The wind picked up and I started heading back before the weather turned. When I got back to the clearing that evening, I found something that hadn't been there before. Near where I'd slept, there was a long mark in the dirt, like something had been dragged across the camp while I was gone. My tent was still standing, but one of the stakes had been pulled out, and the rope was stretched tight, as if someone had tripped on it or pulled it deliberately. That night I didn't light a fire. I stayed inside the tent with my flashlight and my bear spray listening. Around midnight I heard it again. The dragging sound, slow and rhythmic, coming from the trees behind me. Then it stopped. For almost an hour, there was only silence. I tried not to move. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like the sound would give me away. Then I heard something breathing, heavy, wet breaths, right outside the tent wall. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then nothing. When daylight came, I packed up immediately and started back down the trail. I didn't even stop to eat. The forest felt different on the way down, like it was watching me. Every time the wind moved the branches, I froze. I made it back to the ranger station by evening, exhausted and filthy. 2 weeks later, a search and rescue team found a body about a mile downstream from where I had camped. It was a man in his mid-30s, partially buried in mud near the creek. They said he'd been dead for several months. His backpack matched the one I'd found in the lookout. The coroner said it looked like he had fallen or injured his leg, and had tried to crawl his way down the hill before dying from exposure. That explained the dragging sound. He'd been trying to move himself for days before he died. What I heard that night wasn't him, at least, not anymore, but maybe an animal that had been feeding on what was left. After that, I never camped alone again. The park closed off that trail permanently, and the old lookout was torn down. Every time I think back to that night, I still hear that slow, steady dragging in the dark, and I wonder how long he'd been trying to reach help before the forest finally took him. I was assigned to a fire lookout station in northern Montana during late September, a time when most visitors had cleared out and the park started to feel too quiet. The air was crisp and the mornings came with frost that clung to the tall grass. I'd been a ranger for a few years and solitude didn't bother me much. But that assignment, the last one before winter closures, still sticks with me because of how wrong it felt from the first night. The lookout tower sat at the end of a long dirt road that twisted up through dense pine forest. The nearest ranger station was 15 miles away. The tower itself was old, built in the 1940s, all creaking wood and metal stairs that shuddered under your boots. Inside there was a cot, a propane stove, a small table, and a radio that only worked half the time. I was supposed to stay there for 10 days, keeping an eye out for any signs of fire. It sounded simple enough. The first couple of days went as expected. I did my routine checks, logged the weather, and hiked down the slope to a nearby stream to refill my water. I kept busy maintaining the place, cleaning up, tightening window latches, and replacing an old shutter that had come loose. The nights were uneventful, though I noticed how dark it got out there. There was no glow from towns or houses, just complete blackness once the sun went down. On the fourth night, I started hearing something strange. It was a slow crunching sound outside the tower, like heavy footsteps moving around the base. I thought it might have been a deer or maybe a bear. I shined my flashlight down through the window, but I couldn't see anything. The forest floor was just a blanket of pine needles and dead branches, and everything looked still. I stayed up for an hour after that, listening. The noise came and went. Eventually it stopped, and I went back to bed, thinking it was just wildlife. The next morning, when I went down the stairs to check the perimeter, I noticed something odd. About 20 feet from the tower, near the edge of the clearing, the ground was torn up. Not like claw marks or tracks, it looked like someone had been digging. A rough hole about 3 feet across, half a foot deep. No shovel marks, though, just torn dirt, like it had been done by hand or with a stick. I looked around but didn't find anything else, so I filled it back in and didn't think much about it. That evening, I started noticing a smell. It came from somewhere below the tower, something faint but sour, like spoiled meat. I figured maybe a small animal had died under the deck. I went down with a flashlight, crouched beneath the stairs, and checked. There was nothing there. No carcass, no sign of blood or fur, just that smell lingering like something old and wet. I let it go again, thinking maybe it was just decay from something in the soil. The following day, I went for a long patrol. I hiked a few miles down toward the valley to check a section of trail where a mudslide had blocked access earlier that season. It took most of the afternoon, and I didn't get back until dusk. The air was colder that night, and the forest felt tense. Not silent, but strangely restrained, like even the wind didn't want to move. When I got back to the tower, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The dirt near the base had been dug up again, and this time there were 2 holes deeper than before. The soil was damp and clumped, as if it had been scooped out recently. The smell was stronger now. I stood there for a long time, trying to think of a reasonable explanation, but nothing fit. No animal I knew dug holes like that without a clear purpose. And there were no paw prints, no signs of a shovel or tool. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the wood and snap of a branch below made me tense up. Around midnight I heard something again. Not walking this time, but a scraping sound. It went on for several minutes, steady and slow. I grabbed my flashlight and looked down, but the beam didn't reach the ground properly. The scraping stopped when I moved, and the forest went silent again. I stayed awake until dawn, staring through the glass at the trees, waiting for something to move. In the morning, I found something that made me sick to my stomach. A few feet from the base of the tower, a piece of old cloth was half buried in the dirt. It looked like a torn shirt sleeve, faded and stiff with age. Next to it, sticking out from the disturbed soil, was a bit of bone, small, probably from a hand. Human. I froze there for a long time, not wanting to believe it, but the shape was too clear to mistake. I didn't touch anything. I went back up the tower and tried the radio. The signal was weak, full of static, but after several attempts I got through to dispatch. I reported what I found and was told to stay put until a team could reach me the next morning. It was already late in the day, and there was no way for them to make the drive and hike up before dark. That last night was the longest of my life. The wind picked up after sunset, and the whole tower groaned with each gust. Around midnight I heard movement again, slow steps circling the clearing, crunching on the frost-covered grass. I turned off my lantern and crouched near the window. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was down there. Then I heard the faint sound of digging again, that rhythmic tearing of soil. I stayed frozen, gripping the flashlight but too scared to move. It went on for almost an hour before stopping. When the sun came up, the forest looked peaceful again, but I knew what I'd find. I climbed down carefully, feeling like the ground itself was watching me. There were more holes now, at least 5. One of them had been dug almost to a depth of 3 feet, the dirt piled high beside it. Inside I saw pieces of fabric, bone fragments, and what looked like an old boot. It was a shallow grave, or several of them, uncovered by whatever had been at work those nights. By noon, the investigation team arrived, 2 rangers and a county deputy. They marked the site, took photos, and told me to stay back. Later, they found that the graves were decades old, remains from the 1970s, likely from missing persons whose cases were never solved. The official report said the graves had been exposed naturally due to erosion. But I knew what I'd heard and seen. The digging wasn't from rain or weather. Something, or someone, had been there every night, uncovering what had been buried long before I arrived. I left that post the same day, and never volunteered for lookout duty again. Sometimes when I think about that place, I wonder if whoever buried those people had come back after all those years. Not to dig them up for curiosity, but to make sure they were still hidden. The forest keeps its secrets longer than we do, and sometimes it reminds you just how much it's still holding on to beneath the ground. I had been working as a seasonal park ranger in northern Wyoming for about 3 years when this happened. The area was called the Elk Ridge District, a section of rugged forest and canyon land that stretched for miles with barely any cell reception or sign of civilization. It was early fall, the kind of time when the days were still warm but the nights dropped close to freezing. The leaves had turned red and gold, and most of the tourists had already gone. That time of year I was mostly alone. My duties were simple: checking trailheads, closing off certain camping areas for the season, cleaning up sites, and patrolling remote sections for any signs of illegal hunting or fires. One morning, my supervisor told me to inspect a backcountry campsite called Ridge Point that hadn't been checked in over a week. There had been a report of a car parked near the service road for several days with no sign of the owner. Ridge Point wasn't far from there, maybe a 3-mile hike, but it wasn't on a main trail. It was one of those unofficial spots people found on old maps or online forums. A flat clearing above the canyon with a view that drew photographers and backpackers. I loaded my pack with the basics: radio, first aid kit, map, GPS, water, and a tarp, and headed out after noon. The road up was rough, mostly dirt and gravel with fallen branches scattered from the wind the night before. When I reached the end of it, I saw the car they had mentioned, It was a silver Subaru covered in dust, parked slightly crooked beside the trees. The license plate was from Colorado. The doors were locked, and through the window I could see some clothes in the back seat, a couple of water bottles and a hiking backpack that looked fairly new. Nothing seemed damaged or out of place. People left their cars for days all the time, but usually not this late in the season. I marked the car's location and started walking toward Ridge Point. The trail was faint, winding through pines and patches of aspen, covered with dry leaves that crunched with every step. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Not silent, just that kind of muffled quiet where even your own footsteps sound distant. About halfway there, I found a small fire ring near a creek. The ashes were cold but not scattered, which told me someone had used it within the last few days. There were boot prints nearby, medium size, probably a man's. I followed them for a while until they blended with the trail again. The final stretch to Ridge Point was steep. You could feel the elevation climbing, your breath turning shallow. When I reached the clearing, the view opened into a wide canyon with a drop that went straight down hundreds of feet. I stood there for a minute, just catching my breath and scanning the area. The camp was definitely occupied recently. There was a tent still pitched under a tree, a small cooking setup beside it, and a pile of firewood stacked neatly nearby. The tent was zipped closed, but the camp looked untouched, as if the person just stepped away for a few minutes and never came back. I circled around the area first. No signs of animal intrusion or damage. The tent wasn't torn and nothing looked stolen or scattered. The camp stove still had a bit of fuel in it, and there was a half-empty water bottle sitting next to it. I looked inside the tent after a few warnings to make sure I didn't scare anyone if they were inside, but it was empty. There was a sleeping bag laid out, a small journal, some clothes, a flashlight, and a bag of granola. Everything was in order. I sat for a moment trying to piece things together. The car at the trailhead, the used campfire, and this tidy campsite all pointed to someone who'd planned to be here. But there was no sign of the camper anywhere. I noted the GPS coordinates and decided to check the perimeter more thoroughly. About 50 yards west of the camp, I found what looked like a faint path leading down toward the canyon. It wasn't a real trail, more like a runoff channel that people sometimes mistook for one. I followed it down a few yards, careful with my footing. About 20 feet down, I saw something that made me stop. A boot print pressed deep in the dirt pointed downward, then another and another. I followed the prints slowly until I reached a section where the ground gave way to loose gravel and sharp rock. Below that, the slope dropped steeply into the canyon. I crouched and saw what looked like a small piece of fabric snagged on a branch, a shred of dark nylon, maybe from a jacket. When I leaned over to look farther down, I felt my stomach twist. There, maybe 60 or 70 feet below, something bright caught the light. It was the outline of a blue backpack wedged between rocks. I marked the location and radioed in for backup. It took almost 2 hours for the search team to reach me from the main ranger station. By the time they did, the sun was already dipping low. We set up ropes and slowly made our way down. The backpack was intact, but a few feet below it we found him, the missing camper. He was lying face down in a tangle of branches and rock. His body twisted unnaturally. It looked like he had slipped while trying to climb down and tumbled most of the way. His injuries made it clear he hadn't survived the fall. We recovered his belongings and identified him later that evening. He was a 32-year-old photographer from Denver. His family confirmed he had mentioned a solo trip to the area. There was nothing suspicious about it, no foul play, no signs of struggle. Just an accident. One that probably happened when he tried to get a better view of the canyon edge. After the recovery, I had to hike back alone to Ridge Point to collect what was left of his camp. The temperature had dropped and the woods felt different, still and heavy. The tent flapped slightly in the wind as I packed it down. The only sound was the dry leaves brushing against the ground. I loaded everything into my pack and began the walk back toward the service road. Halfway through the return, I stopped near that old campfire by the creek. The ashes seemed darker now, damp from the evening air. I noticed something then that I hadn't before. 2 distinct sets of footprints near the edge. One was clearly his, but the other was smaller, like someone else had been there standing beside him. Maybe another hiker, maybe someone passing through. I don't know. The second set didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped near the water and vanished. I brushed it off as nothing important at the time, maybe old prints from days before he arrived. But still, something about it felt wrong. When I got back to the Subaru, I saw that a thin layer of dust had already settled over the windows again, as if it had been sitting untouched for months instead of days. The air felt colder than it should have been, and I remember just standing there staring at the empty car, thinking about how quiet the whole forest was. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the man's campsite, the neat setup, the half-finished water bottle, the journal still open on a page. He had written notes about the colors of the canyon at sunrise, about how the wind carried the sound of the trees through the valley. The last line he wrote was simple. Might try to get closer to the edge tomorrow. Light looks perfect from there. It was a normal entry. A line that anyone might write without thinking twice. But when I think back to it now, I realize how often people like him, people like me, take this land for granted. We forget how quickly a moment can turn against us. A week later, the campsite at Ridge Point was closed off permanently. The signpost was removed, and the trail to it was left to fade back into the forest. I still patrol that area sometimes, but I never stay long. Every time I walk past that spot, I see the same view he saw, the same drop, the same canyon wind. And I always think about how quiet it was that day, how something so peaceful could feel so heavy once you know what happened there.